Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to settle down beside a gently crackling hearth as we drift back to a world cloaked in shadows and candlelight, a world where justice wore a mask of cruelty and the punishments devised by humankind teetered on the edge of the surreal. This is a tale not merely of iron and gallows, but of the strange ingenuity with which medieval minds sought to discipline, deter, and display. Some punishments you may know, some may slip cold fingers down your spine for the first time, but all are woven into this soft tapestry meant to lull you into slumber, even as it pricks your curiosity. So let us begin this slow, dark journey into the most bizarre punishments of medieval times. In the quiet heart of a medieval village, the air was thick with the scents of peat smoke and freshly turned soil. Here, beneath the high-beamed rafters of timbered houses, life was simple yet ruled by unyielding customs. Justice was not the blindfolded lady of today, but a figure wrapped in local fears, superstition, and the ever-turning wheel of rumor. Imagine, if you will, a narrow cobblestone street winding through a hamlet where every window shutter creaks with secrets, and each corner whispers of retribution for sins both petty and grave. Among the earliest punishments to echo down these lanes was the ducking stool, a crude yet cunning device devised mostly for women accused of scolding tongues or witchery. Picture a simple wooden chair fastened to a long beam, balanced like a child's seesaw over the village pond. The condemned woman, skirts soaked and shivering, was bound tight and lowered into cold, muddy water. Villagers would gather, their breath hanging like ghosts in the dawn mist, to jeer or pray, depending on whether they believed the accused guilty or merely unfortunate. The idea was simple. Too simple, perhaps. Douse the sin out of her, frighten the demon of gossip from her bones, or drown the witch within if she floated too well. Nearby, within the stone walls of a manor's courtyard, another punishment found its grim stage, the scold's bridle. A hideous iron mask, fitted tightly around the head, with a metal bit inserted into the mouth to press down upon the tongue. It was not enough merely to silence. Humiliation was the true goal. The bridle would often have grotesque ornaments, ears like a donkey, horns like a goat, turning the wearer into a mockery of their alleged crime. The victim, usually a woman whose tongue was deemed too sharp or too free, would be paraded through the village, jangling with small bells that summoned curious eyes. Each step became a sermon on the virtue of silence. As night deepens, let us step inside the castle gates, where greater crimes demanded more theatrical penance. Here, noble and peasant alike might find themselves before the stocks, a simple but enduring symbol of medieval shame. A wooden frame, holes for neck and wrists, and the endless mirth gaze of one's neighbors. It was not the confinement that bit deepest, but the hours of ridicule, the rotten vegetables, the cold rain, the unkind whispers. Sometimes children were permitted, encouraged even, to throw filth at the offender, learning young that justice could be watched and wielded like a game. Yet for all its crude simplicity, the stocks were almost gentle compared to the cucking stool's watery trials or the iron bite of the bridle. In some towns, the stocks evolved into the pillory, raising the punished high upon a wooden platform so that their disgrace might be seen from the market square to the church steeple. A thief, a liar, an adulterer. These offenses, small by modern standards, might earn a man hours under the sun, skin blistering, dignity stripped like bark from a tree. Further afield, in bustling medieval cities, where the law was both more sophisticated and more savage, punishments grew stranger still. Consider the practice of caravari, or rough music, a punishment not handed down by the courts, but by neighbors themselves. If a man beat his wife, if a woman betrayed her husband, the village would gather by moonlight with pots and pans, horns and drums. They would surround the wrongdoer's house, clanging and hooting, driving sleep from every bed. Sometimes they would build an effigy, a crude likeness stuffed with straw, and parade it through the streets, mocking and jeering until the culprit emerged, head hung low, shamed into silence by the cacophony. This mingling of spectacle and cruelty, of ritual and ridicule, stitched medieval justice into the fabric of daily life. No sin was too small to escape notice, no punishment too odd to be tried if it would amuse, instruct, or terrify. And beneath it all pulsed the quiet dread that any man or woman might be next. A careless word, a foolish jest, a quarrel overheard by the wrong ear. So, As you close your eyes and listen to the wind sigh through ancient rafters, picture the ducking stool creaking above a black pond, the iron bridle cold against the tongue, the stalks weathered and worn by countless necks and wrists. Imagine how fear stitched itself into the lullabies mother sang, how children learned early to hold secrets tight, to walk with heads bowed when the reeve or bailiff passed by. Tonight, we have dipped only our fingertips into this dark pool of medieval punishments. Ahead lie stranger devices, crueler inventions, and tales so peculiar they linger like cobwebs in the mind. But for now, rest your thoughts here by the hearth. Let the flicker of the fire carry you into dreams of distant centuries, where shadows rule and justice wears 100 bizarre masks, each more curious than the last. The sun rose pale and reluctant over the thatched rooftops of a small market town, its rays glancing off puddles left by a night's drizzle. In the chill dawn, villagers gathered in the square, drawn by the promise of another spectacle, another lesson stitched in flesh and shame. Word had spread that a man, a common baker with flour still clinging to his cuffs, would be made an example of for cheating his neighbors by selling loaves lighter than the law allowed. The punishment for a baker who betrayed his scales was as strange as it was humiliating. In many places, he would be fastened to a wooden board, a pillory on wheels of sorts, and dragged through the streets with a loaf of his deceitful bread hung conspicuously around his neck. But in this town, they favored an older custom, known simply as the false weight ride. They lifted the trembling man onto a rough wooden cart. Around him, the townsfolk jeered softly, but there was no real rage, only a communal need to see balance restored. On his head they placed a fool's cap, sewn hurriedly from scraps, with 2 crooked ears that bobbed with every shudder. A rope tethered him to a barrel of stones, symbolic weight for the weight he had stolen from his customers' tables. Slowly, the cart lurched forward, pulled by a single old mule, its hooves clopping rhythmically against the cobbles. Children ran alongside, giggling at the baker's drooping ears, while a drummer, hired by the reeve, tapped out a mocking cadence. Each turn of the wheel ground the man's pride lower, while the loaf, swinging on its cord, brushed his chest like an accusation that would never sleep. This punishment was not meant to maim or draw blood. Its genius lay in its memory, the way it settled into the minds of those who watched, a whispered warning never to cheat the scales that fed the village's hearths. And when the ride was done, the baker would be dumped unceremoniously at the market gate, the fool's cap snatched by some daring child, the loaf thrown to the dogs. He would trudge home past neighbors who would nod stiffly, remembering the drumbeat whenever they weighed their coins in his palm. Beyond the town walls, the forest pressed close, a shadowed realm where law bent to the will of lords and the harsh quiet of ancient oaks. Here, punishment took on a more sinister air. Some crimes were too delicate for public scorn, whispers of betrayal, hidden thefts, secret trysts that threatened the fragile threads of feudal power. For these, there were darker measures, cloaked in the hush of moonless nights. Picture, if you will, a low stone cellar beneath a minor lord's hall, a single lantern guttering on a hook, its glow licking damp walls. Here, a man accused of poaching the lord's deer, a creature more valuable than any peasant's freedom, might find himself stretched upon a curious bench, known simply as the rack. This was no public show for cackling villagers. It was silent, secret, and cold. The rack did not kill, at least not at first. Its work was to peel truth from the lips of the accused, truth or confessions or convenient lies. The victim's wrists bound to rollers at the head, ankles to the other end, a turn of the handle, and the body grew longer than nature intended. Joints cracked like green wood in a fire. Groans rose through clenched teeth, muffled so that no one beyond those thick walls would hear how justice was made to speak. When the Lord's steward judged the poacher's secrets wrung dry, the man would be thrown to the village like so much offal. Few spoke of what happened in that cellar, but the knowledge of its damp stones crept through the cottages all the same. Better to hunger than to snare a fat buck in the wrong woods. Better to bow one's head than test the Lord's quiet wrath. Yet not all punishments hid in the dark. Some danced brazenly in daylight, woven into fairs and feast days. Take, for instance, the peculiar case of the drunkard's cloak, a punishment that turned sin into absurd theater. When a man or woman drank themselves into foolishness one too many times, the constable would drape them in a barrel. Yes, an actual barrel, hollowed out with holes cut for arms and head. So dressed, the drunkard would be paraded through the village green, stumbling under the weight, their face redder than any wine could stain. Laughter followed them like hungry crows. For an hour or more, they staggered past familiar doorways, humiliated but unharmed, save for the bruises to pride that lingered long after the cloak was lifted away. The drunkard's cloak did more than shame. It warned the young, reminded the old, and satisfied the village's thirst for mischief without drawing a drop of blood. A clever punishment, some said, for it mocked the crime in its very shape. A barrel for a belly, a walking jest for a sin too common to eradicate entirely. Such were the strange tools of medieval justice. Part spectacle, part cruelty, part dark joke, told at the expense of the unlucky soul caught beneath its wheel. They remind us that punishment then was not hidden away in locked rooms or cloaked in legal jargon. It lived and breathed among the people, feeding on gossip and growing in the telling. And so, as dusk settles once more over our imagined village, the baker's cart creaks into memory, the cellar door swings shut, and the drunkard's cloak lies empty in a dusty corner of the constable's shed. But rest assured, stranger things wait in the shadows ahead. Devices so odd, so wickedly clever, they have survived centuries as whispers in old books and tales told by fireside. For now, let your eyelids grow heavy with the thought of that fool's cap bobbing down a cobbled street, a loaf swinging in quiet rebuke. Tomorrow night, we shall lift another stone from this dark garden and peer beneath at what crawls and squirms in the forgotten corners of medieval punishment. Sleep now, gentle dreamer, for the strangest tales are yet to come. As dawn broke once more over mossy rooftops and mist-laced hedgerows, another tale stirred among the thatched dwellings and narrow alleys. This time, our steps carry us not to the bustling market square, nor the Lord's hidden cellar, but to a lonely stretch of road that wound through the heart of the kingdom, a place where law and fear met in one of the most peculiar punishments ever set upon wandering shoulders. It was called the Flute of Shame, a name that sounds almost whimsical until you hear its hollow, mournful notes echoing down the lanes. The flute, in truth, was no instrument of music, but a cruel collar of iron, shaped like a long, perforated pipe that trapped the offender's hands at their throat, forcing them to carry their crime before every passing eye. It was reserved for bad musicians, fiddlers who played at taverns without a license, minstrels who dared strike up a tune that mocked the local lord, or drummers whose wild beats stirred riotous moods among the ale-breathing crowd. Imagine a man, once proud with his lute or bagpipe slung over his shoulder, now shuffling down the road with this iron flute clamped tight around his neck. His wrists locked to the metal, he could neither play nor shield his face from the jeers. Small holes in the device made a strange whistling when the wind passed through, so that every step sang out his shame in ghostly tones, a melody more pitiful than any he might have coaxed from strings or reeds. Children would follow, curious and half-frightened, listening to the sad, airy notes that drifted from the punished man as he trudged from village to village until the steward or reeve deemed his penance paid. There were stories. Who can say if they were true? That some men, in the depths of their despair, would hum along to the flute's mournful tune, turning their punishment into a dirge only they could hear. But if the flute of shame carried a tune of sorrow, then another punishment, born of the same spirit of twisted creativity, rang out with a different kind of note, one of clamor and disgrace. This was the practice of the donkey ride, a punishment especially beloved in towns that prized spectacle above all. When a man was caught in some petty mischief, say, a husband found dallying with another's wife, or a tradesman who lied about his craft, he might find himself hoisted backward onto a donkey, forced to face its tail instead of its ears. A tattered sign would hang around his neck, painted with crude words that told the village of his folly. Sometimes the poor beast's tail would be dipped in paint or ribbons, fluttering absurdly with each plodding step. Unlike the stocks or the rack, the donkey ride did not break the body. It broke the spirit. It made mockery of dignity, for a grown man, clutching the bony rump of a stubborn donkey, as children jeered and pelted him with clods of earth, felt smaller than any beggar crouched in the church porch. In some towns, the rider was expected to bray like his mount if he wished to be released sooner, another layer of ridicule to deepen the wound to his pride. Yet it was not only men who suffered these humiliations. Women, too, found themselves yoked to the harsh creativity of medieval punishments. Consider the punishment known among villagers as the cucking stool sister, the tumbrel. Though similar in spirit to the ducking stool we spoke of before, the tumbrel carried its own peculiar cruelty. Where the ducking stool lowered its victim gently or violently into a pond, the tumbrel placed the accused, most often women suspected of petty theft or adultery, into a barrel fixed upon a pivoting beam. With each push, the barrel spun, rolling its prisoner until her cries mixed with the mocking laughter of the onlookers. Dizzy, bruised, and often sick with the spinning, the poor soul would be tipped out at last, her hair tangled, her dignity scattered like leaves in the wind. It was not just the punishment itself, but the waiting that stung most sharply. The victim might sit for hours upon a bench near the village green, the barrel looming beside her like a promise of shame. Neighbors would pass, whisper, point, some with pity, others with glee. In this slow parade of dread, the mind turned and turned like the tumbrel's axle, inventing fears worse than the reality that awaited. When the moment came, the villagers gathered with baskets of spoiled fruit and handfuls of mud. They jostled for the best view as the barrel was spun, their laughter rising over the clatter of wooden staves and the squeak of the pivot. When it was done, they drifted home, satisfied that order, such as it was, had been restored for another week or month or season. Strange, isn't it, how these punishments, so crude, so simple, worked not just upon the flesh, but upon the imagination? Fear and gossip did half the work. A man who heard the hollow wail of the flute of shame from a mile down the road might think twice before singing a seditious tune. A husband who glimpsed the backward donkey ride might measure his steps more carefully when temptation whispered from a dark doorway. And the village, for all its cruelty, slept soundly, knowing that its order was stitched tight with ridicule and ritual. For in these small communities, punishment was not hidden behind locked doors or high prison walls. It was lived together, endured together, and remembered together, in every story whispered beside the hearth. So as your eyelids grow heavy, think of that iron flute sighing in the night wind, of the donkey's hooves striking sparks on cobbles, of the tumbrel's barrel spinning under an indifferent sky. Let these strange echoes lull you deeper into the soft darkness, where the punishments of the past drift like old songs half forgotten, but never quite lost. And know that tomorrow's tale will open yet another door in this curious gallery of medieval retribution, where imagination knew no bounds and shame wore 1,000 shapes beneath the cold moon. In the hush that follows a restless night, when dawn has not yet shaken the last stars from the sky, the village wakes slowly. Fireplaces crackle to life, roosters crow their thin notes into drifting mist, and people murmur of chores and markets. But somewhere beyond the neat lines of timbered cottages, down a winding track flanked by hedges and blackthorn, stands a lonely gallows tree, unused, yet always there like a shadow at the edge of thought. Tonight, let us drift our weary minds toward this grim symbol of final justice, and to a punishment not quite as final as hanging, but close enough to chill the bone, a punishment known in some parts as the gibbet cage. In the corners of the medieval world where forest met road and law clashed with banditry, the gibbet cage was both warning and spectacle. When a crime was deemed heinous enough, murder, highway robbery, or treason, a man might find his sentence did not end at the noose, but continued long after breath had fled his body. Picture this: a rough iron cage, shaped like a human silhouette, its bars welded to encase the shape of a man from head to toe. Once the condemned had been hanged by the neck until dead, his body, limp and still clothed in the tatters of his final hour, was placed within this rigid prison. The cage was then hoisted high upon a stout wooden post beside a crossroads or a main thoroughfare where travelers would see and shudder. Rain washed over the iron. Wind rattled the loose bones inside like dry reeds. Crows perched and pecked without fear, their dark wings flapping at dawn and dusk. By day, the cage cast a long, crooked shadow that crawled across the road. By night, when the moon hung pale above, Villagers claimed they heard the iron creak as if the dead man still shifted, restless in his steel cradle. Some said the gibbet's true cruelty was not for the dead, but for the living. Wives who dared not pass that way. Children who woke crying from dreams of the hollowed eyes swaying overhead. And yet, for all its horror, it worked. Stories tell of entire bands of highwaymen disbanding at the sight of a gibbet newly raised beside their favorite road. For who wished to swing eternally, turning slowly to the rhythm of the wind? But if the gibbet cage belonged to the lonely roads, then another punishment lurked within the village itself, stitched into daily life, subtle, lingering, and humiliating in ways that lingered far beyond stocks or pillory. This was the mark of shame, the brand. Branding in its medieval form was simple and terrible. For thieves caught once too often, for men or women found guilty of repeat sins, whether they be petty or grave, the hot iron was a tool of memory. It needed no gallows tree nor iron cage. It required only a small hearth, a steady hand, and the eyes of the village fixed upon the guilty. Imagine the village square at midday. A blacksmith's brazier glows fierce and red. The reeve or constable stands beside it, a thin rod of iron ending in a letter, a T for thief, an F for forger, an M for murderer in some cases. The condemned is brought forth, bound not with iron, but with the weight of every gaze that burns hotter than any flame. His tunic is torn at the collar, the soft skin of his cheek or forehead laid bare. When the iron touches flesh, it hisses like wet wood on a fire. The mark blooms raw and terrible, a scar that will never fade entirely, no matter how many seasons pass or how far the branded man tries to run. It is a punishment that follows the bearer into every tavern, every market stall, every church pew. It is whispered behind his back, pointed out with the flick of a finger or the averted eyes of children. There are old tales, half believed, of branded men who tried to burn or cut away the mark, who rode for distant towns hoping new faces would not see what the hot iron had carved into them. But rumor travels swifter than any horse. The mark made the guilty visible, a living signpost of the village's justice. And in strange contrast, somewhere between the cruel finality of the gibbet and the quiet horror of the brand, there lingered a punishment that was almost absurd, so bizarre it balanced mockery with pain. This was the use of the shrew's fiddle, a wooden contraption devised for quarrelsome folk who disturbed the fragile peace with endless bickering. The shrew's fiddle was simple, 2 planks of wood hinged together with holes for the neck and wrists. When locked inside, the victim's hands were held before their face, so they could neither feed themselves easily nor hide from the eyes of passers-by. But the real genius lay in its communal twist. For 2 who fought like cats, say neighbors whose fences never held, or spouses whose rows woke the entire street, both might be locked face to face in a double fiddle. There they would stand in the village square, forced to look into each other's eyes, forced to bear the laughter and sly comments of onlookers. They might spit insults at first, red-faced and trembling, but hour after hour, discomfort and shame wore down even the fiercest tongue. By dusk, they would be silent, too weary to bicker, united at last by mutual humiliation. In this way, the medieval world taught its lessons not just with blade and gallows, but with odd inventions that turned the guilty into living theater. Every punishment was a story told aloud, one that the village carried home in whispers to frighten children into obedience, and to remind each soul how thin the line was between freedom and disgrace. So as the candle burns low beside your bed, think of that iron gibbet swaying in the wind, the hiss of the branding iron, the awkward silence between 2 locked in the shrew's fiddle. Let these visions drift through your thoughts like a cold breeze through ancient trees, reminders that in those distant times, fear and shame were as sharp as any sword. And tomorrow, when you return to this hearth of whispered tales, we shall open another chamber in this shadowed gallery, where stranger, darker punishments wait, each more curious than the last, each woven into the endless tapestry of medieval justice. Rest now and dream deep beneath your blanket of soft night. The road ahead is long, and the stories have only begun to unfurl. In the quiet hush of dawn, when mist still clings to the furrows of plowed fields and the air smells faintly of damp earth and chimney smoke, the village begins its slow waking. Yet somewhere, beyond the reach of cockerels crowing and the soft gossip of milkmaids, stands a small, grim chamber known by many names, the criminal's cage, the whipping post, or simply, to those who dreaded its splintered wood, the post of sorrows. Tonight, let your thoughts drift to this forgotten corner of the medieval world, a punishment that married pain and spectacle, the raw sting of flesh to the sharp bite of public disgrace. The whipping post was as simple as it was enduring. A stout beam driven deep into the ground, iron rings hammered in place, ropes thick as a man's thumb dangling at the ready. When a thief, a blasphemer, or a debt dodger found himself judged too troublesome for stocks but too petty for the noose, the post became his confessor. Bound with arms stretched high or fastened tight around the waist, the condemned would feel the cold bite of iron against his skin before the lash even sang its cruel hymn. Picture the village gathered, old men leaning on staves, children peeking from behind their mothers' skirts, the reeve standing solemn with the law rolled tight in his fist. The constable steps forward, whip in hand, its leather braids darkened by years of use. There is no music here, only the shuffle of feet on packed earth, the snap of the whip through air, and the sharp cry that escapes even the bravest lips when leather kisses flesh. The law, in its wisdom, often prescribed a number: 20 lashes for petty theft, 40 for slander against the Lord, more if the victim dared resist or curse his fate. With each stroke, the lesson sank deeper than any sermon could reach. Blood spattered the base of the post, and the wind carried the scent to every nose, a reminder that rules were not words alone, but pain made visible. Yet the whipping post's cruelty did not end when the lash fell silent. The condemned, his back a lattice of welts and raw furrows, would be left tied for hours or even days. Flies gathered. Rain stung the wounds like salt. Passers-by might stop to stare, some with pity, some with grim satisfaction. When the ropes were cut at last, the sinner stumbled away, bearing on his skin a memory that would outlive any gossip. But for some crimes, simple lashes were not enough. The medieval mind, restless in its inventiveness, devised tools to prolong and deepen the sting. There was, for example, the cat o' nine tails, a whip with many tongues, each knotted or tipped with small iron barbs. A single stroke of this devilish thing tore more than skin. It laid bare muscle, left scars that no passage of time could fully heal. Sometimes the punishment became almost ritualistic. In certain towns, the condemned was led from crossroads to crossroads, flogged at each stopping point to remind every hamlet and farmstead that crime knew no hiding place. Witnesses whispered prayers or turned their faces away, but the message took root like thorns in soft earth. Break the law, and the law will break you in return. Yet not all whipping was meted out on bare skin alone. In coastal towns, sailors who mutinied or cheated the ship's hold were tied to the mainmast for the flogging round the fleet. Here the condemned was rowed from ship to ship, each crew ordered to deliver a lash as the man hung half-conscious over the gunwale. Salt spray mixed with sweat and blood, gulls shrieked overhead, and the sea carried away the cries, an endless witness to maritime justice. If the whipping post taught pain, then the cucking stool, the stocks, and the shrew's fiddle taught shame. But some punishments combined both, weaving pain and ridicule into a single, unforgettable torment. One such was the punishment of the kneeling stone. In some northern villages, a flat slab of granite was set before the church doors. Those who lied in court, who broke their oaths or slandered the good name of their neighbors, were made to kneel upon this cold stone from sunrise to sunset. Knees pressed to unyielding rock, hands clasped in forced penance, the sinner was an image of miserable devotion. Parishioners stepping into worship would glance at the kneeling figure, then at one another, exchanging the unspoken reminder that deceit had a price measured in hours and aching joints. Rain might fall. Snow might drift against the hem of a tunic. Still, the kneeling continued until the church bell tolled dusk. And in this silent punishment lay a certain quiet power. No whip cracked, no iron hissed red hot. The mind did the work instead, gnawing at pride, burrowing into memory. Many a man rose from the kneeling stone so stiff and broken that he would confess sins yet unspoken just to be done with the burden. And though the stone stood humble beneath its church wall, it whispered its lesson louder than any priest's sermon. Truth, like cold granite, could wear a body down until all that remained was humility. As the last embers of your candle flicker low tonight, Let your thoughts wander past the whipping post's splintered beam, past the raw backs and the salt wind that carried curses to the sea. Imagine the quiet figure kneeling at dawn's edge, the stone biting into bone, the village watching with a silence thicker than any rope. These punishments, so strange and harsh, did more than mark the guilty. They marked the living memory of a people who believed that justice must be seen, felt, and feared. And still, beyond this pale ring of torchlight, stranger contrivances wait, dark shapes yet to be glimpsed in the glow of our shared tale. So close your eyes now. Drift deeper into the dream of old villages and their curious cruelties. Tomorrow's fireside will warm your hands again, and together we shall lift the latch on yet another door in this long corridor of medieval punishments, where imagination knew no mercy and shame was shaped as sharply as any blade. Rest well and dream in shadows. When dawn breaks once more over moss-covered roofs and the soft sweep of orchard branches heavy with dew, the village stirs to life, unaware that somewhere, tucked behind a crumbling wall or hidden in the quiet corner of a manor's courtyard, waits yet another relic of punishment, one so curious and cruel it lingers in whispers even now. Tonight, we draw aside the veil on the Iron Maiden, that infamous chamber of dread, though not always as the tales later claimed. In truth, the Iron Maiden as we know it, a tall, coffin-like cabinet lined with cruel spikes, belongs more to the fevered imaginings of later centuries than to everyday medieval courts. Yet its spirit, its rumor, its grim silhouette were rooted in very real devices of confinement and pain. And in those stone-walled dungeons where torchlight flickered over damp flagstones, punishments of enclosing iron were born, each stranger than the last. Picture a small fortress perched atop a lonely hill where the wind keens through arrow slits like a restless ghost. Deep below the Lord's Hall, past rows of barrels and cold stores of salted meat, lies a cell too narrow for any man to lie down within. This was the standing cage, a simple iron lattice shaped like a man, into which the condemned was locked upright. Too low to stand fully straight, too tight to curl up within, the prisoner learned quickly that sleep was a luxury paid for in bruised skin and numb limbs. Sometimes the cage hung outdoors, a dark shape swaying from a stout beam so the entire village might see the offender's shame. Rain washed over his shoulders, wind chilled him to the marrow, and the iron bars left wheels on flesh that could not shift or flee. This punishment did not seek quick confession or even execution, but the slow gnaw of time, the cruel partnership of hunger, thirst, and the unrelenting ache of cramped joints. In the cold hours before dawn, passers-by might swear they heard soft groans drifting from the cage, though whether it was the prisoner or the cage itself, creaking in the restless wind, none could be sure. And so stories bloomed, as they always do, twining fact and fear into something too strange to be forgotten. Yet while some lords favored the spectacle of the standing cage, others preferred subtler tortures, devices that struck not at the body directly, but at the mind and soul. Among these was the oubliette, whose very name is a whisper of its purpose, from the French oublier, to forget. The oubliette was a prison within a prison, a narrow pit sunk deep into castle foundations, accessible only through a trapdoor above. Once lowered by rope or ladder, the prisoner was left alone in darkness, so complete that days and nights melted into a single formless torment. Food, when offered, came only when the jailer remembered, passed down on a rope like scraps tossed to a stray dog. There was no room to stand fully, barely space to sit comfortably, just cold stone, damp air, and the slow unraveling of thought. It was said that in some keeps, the oubliette was not emptied when its wretched tenant died. Instead, the bones of those who had vanished before became the silent company of the new occupant, their hollow eyes unseen yet deeply felt in every rustle and drip of cold water seeping from above. But not all bizarre punishments were born of iron or stone. Some reached back into an older, darker magic, rituals of humiliation that tangled the church, the law, and the folk beliefs of a people desperate to control what they feared. Take, for instance, the ritual of the sin eater. In small villages where the parish priest's word weighed heavier than any reeve's stick, a man or woman suspected of terrible crimes might be forced to endure the sin eater's visit before the village's watching eyes. Bread and salt were laid upon the chest of the accused, alive or, in some grim cases, newly dead, and the sin eater, a wretched soul paid in coin and scorn, would eat the meal from the sinner's body. This strange rite was meant to draw the sin out, to purify the soul by passing its burden onto another. For the condemned, the shame was twofold: the public knowledge of their guilt and the sight of their crimes made visible as crumbs and salt upon their flesh. And when the ritual ended, the village knew the sin eater walked away heavy with corruption, an outcast living on the fringes, reviled yet needed. The criminal's punishment was to be cleansed, but the stain never truly vanished. It clung to rumor, to bloodlines, to the hush of gossip long after the grave closed its mouth. Such rituals remind us that medieval punishments often bled beyond the flesh and the iron. They lived in the soul's hidden corridors, in the deep fear of what might linger after the rope snapped or the stocks fell silent. Justice, in that world of candlelight and superstition, demanded more than chains. It demanded a show, a story to carry into the next generation. And so tonight, as the wind sighs at your window, think of that narrow iron cage swaying on its creaking hook. Think of the oubliette's darkness swallowing a man whole, of bread and salt laid upon a trembling chest while villagers hold their breath. These were the cruelties hidden behind stone walls, whispered of in taverns when the fire burned low. Close your eyes now, and let these shadows drift soft around you like an old wool cloak. For tomorrow, when the embers glow anew, we shall open yet another chapter of this long, strange tale, where punishment wore the face of spectacle, dread, and the endless hunger of the human mind for control. Rest easy, gentle listener, and dream of iron and whispers, forgotten yet forever alive in the dark corners of our history. As the first light of dawn glimmers through the lattice of cottage shutters and the crows caw softly from the eaves of mossy barns, our path drifts onward, deeper into the hush of medieval punishments that blurred the line between the lawful and the grotesque. Tonight, let your mind wander toward a place both familiar and unsettling, a place where punishment met performance, and the body itself became a living stage for justice's cruel art. This is the tale of the cucking stool's cousin, the jugs and the pillory tree, and of a punishment that turned idle whispers into sharp tongues of mockery, binding not just the flesh, but the spirit of the shamed. In many villages, the churchyard or the green at the heart of town would host an old oak or ash, its roots burrowed deep beside the chapel walls. Upon its sturdy trunk, iron bands were fastened, rusted hoops known as the jugs. Unlike stocks that pinned hands and feet, the jugs were a collar of iron locked about the neck, tethering the condemned to the tree for all to see. The crime? Often slight, a harsh word against the priest, a rumor spread too freely, a small theft of firewood from the Lord's forest. The punishment was humiliation, pure and raw. No lash split the skin, no brand seared the flesh, but there the culprit stood, neck chafed by cold iron, unable to shrink from the watchful eyes of neighbors and kin. Sometimes the parish clerk read aloud the offense, repeating it so even the deafest old widow could hear. Children gathered, pointing at the miserable figure bound upright as if the tree itself had sprouted a strange fruit of disgrace. There was no shelter from rain or wind, only the slow passing of hours and the murmur of villagers hurrying by with baskets, their gossip sinking deeper than any whip's cut. Yet more curious still were the living pillories that some hamlets devised when no tree grew stout enough for jugs. In these cases, a wooden post would be erected at the market cross, fitted with a collar and sometimes a shelf beneath the culprit's chin to force their head high. Such contraptions might remain in place for generations, silent sentinels of the village's collective memory, waiting to clasp the next loose tongue or light-fingered hand. But not all who suffered this fate endured it alone. In some cases, two quarreling neighbors, much like the shrew's fiddle, were locked side by the same iron ring, forced to share their shame and reconcile beneath the public's mocking eyes. The church bells might toll each hour they stood there, the sound folding their disgrace into the very heartbeat of the community. Beyond the village green and the pillory tree, stranger punishments sprouted like weeds in the fields of medieval imagination. One of the most curious was the use of badges of infamy, symbols sewn or branded onto clothing so that shame walked with the wearer wherever they went. In some towns, a man found guilty of cowardice in battle might be forced to wear a yellow patch shaped like a hair, tail and ears drooping in mute insult. Adulterers might bear a letter A upon their sleeve or tunic, a quiet confession stitched into every greeting and every door they knocked upon. Even lesser crimes could summon this needle of disgrace. A butcher who sold spoiled meat, a miller who shorted the village's grain, all might be marked out by a scrap of cloth that whispered their sins to any curious eye. To tear off the badge was to court harsher punishment. For if the symbol vanished, the Reeves men would come with irons, ready to press a mark into the flesh itself, a scar that no tailor's skill could ever hide. Thus the badge was worn like a second skin, a living reminder that in the medieval mind, shame must be visible, carried not just in whispers but in the threads of daily life. Perhaps most chilling were the masks, grotesque visages of iron and leather, crafted not to protect but to mock. A gossip who poisoned wells of peace with her words might find herself locked into a scold's mask, a cage of iron that pressed a bridle against the tongue and sprouted horns or ears to render her beastly in the eyes of her neighbors. Some masks bore bells that jingled with every step, summoning the curious and the cruel. Others were painted in garish colors or adorned with a pig's snout, a donkey's ears, the twisted grin of a devil. Forced to wear such a thing through the village streets, the condemned became walking theater, a lesson and a warning, laughter and fear bound into one pitiful figure. Even in the church, there was no escape from these masks. Some parish courts, when faced with chronic scolds or slanderers, would force the guilty to sit through Sunday service in full view, the mask rattling with every prayer, the shame sharper than any sermon. No penance or coin could buy back the dignity lost once the mask had been clamped shut. It is easy to think of these contraptions now as relics of cruelty, but in their time, they were seen as tools of order, humiliation that rotted away sin like salt upon an open wound. The village slept easier for it. Mothers scolded wayward children with tales of the mask and the collar, and men thought twice before wagging their tongues too freely beneath the tavern's beam. And so, as your eyelids grow heavy beside your hearth, imagine that tree at the village green, roots tangled deep beneath the church's shadow. Picture the iron collar waiting, its chill kissing the neck of yet another careless soul. Hear the rustle of gossip as neighbors pass by, and the jingle of bells on a mask that mocks the very words that condemned its wearer. Let these visions drift through your dreams like echo of old church bells, reminders that shame, in the medieval mind, was more than punishment. It was the cord that bound each soul to the quiet rules of life and death. Rest now, gentle dreamer, for the road winds ever onward, and stranger punishments yet wait behind tomorrow's dusk, curious, cruel, and stitched forever into the tapestry of forgotten nights. In the hush before dawn, when the last embers of the hearth sigh into ash, and the cockerel's cry has yet to break the stillness, let us drift once more through crooked lanes and candlelit halls to find another corner of medieval punishment, one that stirs a deeper unease, for it touches the sacred space between flesh and faith. Tonight, we wander into the realm of penance parades and barefoot pilgrimages, punishments that turn the road itself into a crucible of shame and redemption, where stocks and iron collars work their cruelty through cold metal and callous crowds. These journeys bound the sinner to the road, the weather, and the eyes of every stranger along the way. Picture a frost-laced dawn in a stone-paved village. A man stands at the church door, his head bowed, his shoulders draped not in a cloak, but in a coarse penitent's robe, rough wool the color of ash. Around his neck, a rope, frayed and heavy, like a leash leading him not to prison but through the village lanes. He is barefoot, though the road is sharp with pebbles and rimed with morning frost. His crime may have been blasphemy, adultery, or some breach of holy oath, sins that demanded more than coin or lash. They demanded public penance, plain for all to witness. The priest steps forward, lifting a staff topped with a small iron cross. With a solemn chant, he blesses the journey, not with comfort, but with a curse that each stone underfoot might remind the sinner of his trespass. The village gathers close, women clutching their children's hands, men lowering their hats in wary silence. Then, with a nod, the penitent takes his first step onto the frozen path. Through the winding lanes he goes, past the blacksmith's forge, where sparks sputter like tiny stars, past the mill where water wheels creak in morning mist. At each crossroads, he must kneel and recite a prayer aloud, a confession turned into theater beneath the pale sky. Some neighbors whisper blessings, others mutter curses, for it is said that too public a sin taints the soil it walks upon. In some towns, the penitent's road was short, around the churchyard 3 times, then to the altar where absolution might be granted with trembling hands. But for graver sins, the journey stretched far beyond the village. Pilgrimage became punishment, a trek to a distant shrine, perhaps 100 miles or more, to be walked barefoot and begging bread at every door. Imagine the weary feet pressing into mud and gravel, through cold streams and over bramble-choked paths. Nights spent beneath hedgerows, the robe soaking up dew like a sponge, the rope collar gnawing at the neck. In the eyes of each farmer or reeve who offered a crust of bread, the penitent saw his own disgrace reflected back, a living reminder that sin, once loosed upon the world, never walked alone. Such pilgrimages were not only for men. Women, too, might be sent along the rough roads with prayers and jeers echoing at their back. Some carried iron crosses lashed to their shoulders, their hands raw where wood bit skin. Others dragged stones tied to their waists, a weight to match the burden in their hearts. And when they reached the shrine, be it the relics of a saint or the bones of some martyr locked in cold stone, they would kneel upon the flagstones until their knees bled. The priest at the shrine would hear their penance, grant absolution, or demand more, a coin for the poor, another mile walk barefoot, a vow never to return home until the priest's word came by letter or rumor. Back in their villages, life paused and murmured around their absence. Children whispered of the mother on her knees in far-off Canterbury or Santiago. Husbands and fathers learned new habits of silence, for gossip had sharp teeth when a family's shame walked openly on pilgrim roads. And when the penitent returned, if they returned at all, they came home thinner, quieter, carrying not just the dust of distant chapels, but the invisible brand of a sin that never quite washed clean. Somewhere between these humble pilgrimages and the grandeur of high churches, another strange punishment found root, the ritual of wearing relics in mockery. A sinner might be forced to carry a wooden cross, not in reverence, but in shame. Sometimes it was small enough to sling across the back, sometimes large enough to drag through the lanes, its beam gouging furrows into the dirt road behind. Villagers would fall silent as the condemned passed, the creak of timber and the drag of rope speaking louder than any priest's sermon. If a man broke an oath to the church, stealing tithes, lying under sacred vow, he might be forced to stand beside the altar at Sunday Mass, barefoot, cross upon his shoulder, eyes downcast as neighbors filed past. Some were made to repeat this ritual week after week until the priest deemed their soul sufficiently bruised for forgiveness. And so, in these roads and churches, fields and shrines, medieval punishment shaped not just the body but the spirit, threading penance into daily life like rough wool into linen. It reminded each villager that no sin was too small to slip unseen into the world's memory. The journey itself became a prayer, each mile a bruise, each stone underfoot a whisper of what could be lost when one strayed too far from the narrow path. As you drift now into sleep, imagine that pilgrim's figure, bowed beneath the dawn, his feet cracked and bleeding upon frost-kissed earth. Picture the quiet lane behind him, marked by footprints and old murmurs that linger long after the road forgets. For in the old world's eyes, penance was not only an end, but a passage, a path where punishment became its own prayer, echoing softly in the hush of dawn. Rest now, and hold this vision close, for tomorrow we shall wander yet again through these cobbled corridors of strange, forgotten justice, where each punishment, like a winding road, carries its own story through time's unending dusk. When the night folds its velvet cloak around the village, and the last glow of hearth fires fades to embers, old tales settle among the rafters, like patient spiders, waiting for ears to listen. Tonight, we draw near once more to the quiet cruelty of medieval minds, this time to a punishment that lurked where law, rumor, and superstition met, the ordeal. Where the stocks humiliated and the whip scarred the flesh, the ordeal tested the very soul, laying guilt and innocence bare before the eyes of heaven. In a world where parchment law and rough justice walked hand in hand with whispered prayers and dread of the devil's cunning, the ordeal was both trial and punishment, wrapped into one terrible moment. Consider first the ordeal by water, a test often summoned when witchcraft or hidden treachery was suspected, but could not be proved by witness alone. A man or woman, hands bound tightly at the wrists, might be led to the village pond or the black mouth of a forest pool. There, before the gathered hush of neighbors, the accused was lowered gently or tossed roughly into the waiting water. The water, so the churchman preached, was pure, a holy judge that would accept the innocent into its depths while rejecting the guilty, forcing them to bob like driftwood upon the surface. It was cruel in its simplicity. To sink was proof of virtue, but risk drowning before rescuing hands could pull the victim free. To float was proof of guilt, and a fate yet worse, for the rope and the stake might follow swiftly behind. The villagers watched from the bank, breath held tight, skirts lifted from the muddy edge. Some crossed themselves fervently, praying the water's truth might wash the sin clean or drag a hidden witch to her grave. And when the pond grew still again, when the condemned gasped in the shallows or lay cold upon the grass, the verdict was accepted as heaven's own word. Yet ordeal by water was not alone in its grim theater. In the solemn hush of a stone church, ordeal by fire burned just as fiercely in the imagination of an age that trusted in God's mercy, yet feared his silence. Here, the accused might be made to carry a glowing iron bar 3 paces across the nave, bare hands clasping the searing rod while priests chanted and the faithful watched with wide, unblinking eyes. Once done, the burned hand was bound in clean linen, sealed with holy wax. 3 days passed while the wound festered or healed. On the appointed morning, the priest unwrapped the bandages before all. If the flesh was red but whole, the soul was judged pure. If blackened and corrupted, guilt bloomed as surely as rot in a wound. The judgment lay not in the priest's word alone, but in the wound's slow whisper to those who leaned in close, hearts hammering at the thought that even flesh might lie if it dared. Some places favored the ordeal by boiling water instead, an iron cauldron bubbling in the open square, watched over by hooded monks and curious children. Into its depths, the accused would plunge a bare arm to retrieve a stone or iron ring from the simmering water. As with the glowing rod, the wound's healing would reveal the truth, or so they believed, with a fervor that turned the simple hiss of steam into a psalm of dread. For lords and knights, the ordeal could take stranger shapes yet. Trial by combat was its own dance with death, an ordeal of blood and steel. Here, guilt and innocence rested not on wounds that healed, but on the clash of blades under the eye of a gathered court. 2 men stood before the baron's dais, accuser and accused, swords drawn, mail glinting in the brittle dawn light. To win was to stand righteous in the eyes of God, the victor's blade anointed by divine favor. To fall was to confess one's sin with a final gasp in the dirt. Some battles were over in a heartbeat. A shield splintered, a helm cracked open like an egg. Others dragged on under a sun that climbed and dipped while watchers pressed closer, each clash of iron singing the same grim question. Who does heaven favor this day? It is easy now, from soft beds and warm rooms, to look back on such trials and shudder at their blind faith in suffering as a mirror of the soul. Yet to those who knelt in cold chapels, who slept lightly for fear of witches and devils lurking at the edge of lamp glow, these ordeals brought order to chaos. They held the village together like rough stitches in fraying cloth. Each trial a reminder that sin could not slip quietly into the shadows. And so the ordeal lingered, by fire, by water, by combat, woven into the life of towns and forests alike. Its memory curls around old stones still, in ruined abbeys where pilgrims once knelt beside iron cauldrons and monks whispered prayers above wounds blistered raw by faith. So tonight, as you drift further from wakefulness, imagine the hush of villagers at the pond's edge, the hiss of red iron, the ring of steel in the frosty air at dawn. See the faces turned upward, eyes wide with fear and fierce hope that somewhere beyond the wound and the water, a just God watched and weighed each trembling soul. Rest now, and let the soft hush of night enfold you like linen around a healing hand. Tomorrow we shall gather once more by this quiet hearth to lift another stone from the past, to find yet stranger punishments hidden where faith, fear, and the restless need for order once joined hands beneath the ancient sky. When dawn unfurled her pale gold across the cobblestones of a quiet medieval village, Life seemed deceptively simple. Yet beneath that pastoral hush lurked shadows of judgment more peculiar than any thunderstorm or lurking wolf. In this 10th telling, our lantern drifts toward the echoing chambers of a stone-walled castle, where an unusual sentence awaited a man whose tongue had wandered too freely. His name has been lost to time, but the villagers remembered his punishment long after his bones were dust. He was a bard once, weaving songs that lifted spirits by hearthsides and in dim taverns. Yet the same tongue that praised a maiden's smile or the warmth of summer wine grew careless one wintry night. A jest about the local lord, harmless to the bard, fatal to his freedom, fluttered from his lips like a moth to flame. And so he found himself dragged before the hall's roaring fireplace, where the lord's narrow eyes glittered like frost on an iron gate. This lord, unlike others who might have demanded silver or an apology, believed firmly that words carried power enough to wound the soul, and so they must be answered with an equally pointed punishment. In the hush of that great hall, where tapestries of hunts and holy battles fluttered in candle drafts, he pronounced a sentence both cruel and strange. The bard would wear the brazen mask. The brazen mask was not as plain as its name. It was a heavy helm of beaten bronze, shaped to mock the offender's own face but twisted into an eternal leer. Hooks on the inside forced the wearer's lips into a sneer, teeth forever bared like a wolf's. A forked tongue of iron jutted from its mouth, a grotesque reminder of the traitorous flesh beneath. It was chained to the neck so that it could not be lifted or shifted, and every word spoken within echoed back, turning speech into garbled torment. In the days that followed, the bard was made to stand in the village square, mask gleaming under the pale sun. Children dared each other to touch him, giggling and fleeing when the distorted rasp of his voice met their ears. Mothers turned their heads away, pulling cloaks tighter. The bard, once the soul of feasts and weddings, now hummed with shame in every bent knee and averted eye. Yet the punishment did not stop at mere spectacle. To speak at all was agony, for the iron tongue rattled against his teeth, and the hooks tugged at his skin when he moved his lips. Food was spooned through narrow slits, water dripped in with humiliating slowness. At night, chained by the stocks beside the village well, he could hear the mutters of those who pitied him, and those who whispered that they too should be careful of the words they wove in ale-sweet shadows. In the cold weeks that followed, the bard's songs shriveled inside him. No melody could pass those metal lips without shredding his mouth raw. He dreamt instead of his old ballads, soft refrains of lovers parting by the river's bend, or odes to a summer sun that never seemed so far as it did now. But the dreams offered no warmth, only reminders of the warmth he had lost. One dusk, as mist rose like a ghostly army from the moors, an old friend came to stand before him. She had been a maiden of the tavern once, the subject of more than one lyric. Her eyes shimmered with pity, though she dared not remove the mask. Such mercy would mean her own neck in the stocks. Instead, she placed a small vial in his bound hands, rose oil, to soothe the rawness where the mask's edges dug deep. She could not free him, but she could offer a kindness, as soft and fleeting as a whisper on the wind. Days turned to weeks, and the Lord's satisfaction waned. The bard's punishment was not meant to kill, but to brand a lesson into the marrow of the town. Careless words bear heavy chains. When the sentence ended, the mask was unlocked at dawn. The bard's lips, cracked and bruised, trembled in the cold air. But no words came. He had given up his tongue to the iron long before the key turned in its lock. He did not remain in the village long after his release. Some say he wandered to the coast, to find solace in the roar of the tide where no one could silence him. Others swear they heard him deep in the forests, humming broken notes to the birds that did not care for gossip or jest. Wherever he vanished, the brazen mask remained, hung in the castle's great hall, a mute reminder to every guest who dared lift a goblet and speak too freely. In time, other masks were forged for other tongues, each more grotesque than the last. A gossiper's mask shaped like a braying ass. A slanderer's helm, crowned with bells that rang with every nod of the head. Each a strange theater of shame, played out on streets and squares, where folk gathered to remind themselves that the price of speech could be iron and jeering laughter. So the villagers learned to weigh their words like coins, counting each syllable for fear it might be snatched and twisted against them. And though centuries have passed, echoes of that leering mask linger in old tales told by firesides, where grandfathers hush their grandchildren with a knowing look. Be wary of the words you loose into the world, for in the hush between heartbeats, they may return clad in bronze and chains, heavy as regret. And so our lantern dims here, but not the hush of curiosity that settles in your mind. For stranger punishments yet remain, tangled in the pages of history's forgotten courtrooms and hidden dungeons. When next we meet, we shall drift further down this winding corridor of human cunning and cruelty, where the oddest judgments still lie waiting in the dark. When winter's chill tightened its grip upon the village lanes and the castle walls alike, folk gathered close to hearths and candles, whispering of justice that bent the mind as well as the body. From the tale of the brazen mask, our path now winds deeper into the realm of punishment, devised not with iron alone, but with bitter mockery, an echo of cruelty that lingered long after bruises faded. This tale brings us to the edge of a kingdom where punishment took the form of a seat known in hushed tones as the cucking stool. In this quiet hamlet, half forgotten by the crown and distant from any grand cathedral, life unfolded around the steady pulse of the village green and the murmuring river that wound through its heart. Here, gossip was as constant as the crows in the fields, and suspicion curled like smoke through thatched roofs. It was said that idle words could sour the milk, wilt the crops, or draw sickness into a healthy house. And so, when a woman's tongue was deemed too sharp, when rumor pinned her as a scold, a shrew, or worse, she was given the cucking stool. Unlike the iron mask that stilled the bard's songs, the cucking stool made its lesson a spectacle. The stool itself was simple, a rude wooden chair bound to a long beam that swung like a seesaw above the village pond. At first glance, it looked harmless, almost foolish in its simplicity. Yet for those who sat upon it, the water below was no pond of gentle lilies but a cold mirror of public shame. On a morning veiled in thin mist, a woman named Marjorie found herself marched through the village by the reeve and two stout men with cords looped about their arms. Her crime was no theft nor witchery. She had simply spoken too freely of her neighbor's misdeeds, weaving tales of a husband's wandering eye and the miller's sly thumb on the scale. Each word had bloomed like nettles in a field until the village elders decided enough was enough. They dragged her to the pond's edge, where the stool waited, its beam creaking under the weight of damp mist. Villagers circled close, shawls wrapped tight against the cold, eyes hungry for the lesson about to unfold. Marjorie, hands bound, lips pressed thin as a seam, refused to beg. She had no illusions that words would spare her now. At the reeve's signal, she was lashed to the chair, rough ropes at her wrists, another about her waist to keep her upright when the water came. The beam groaned as men pushed it out over the pond's gray skin. Children jostled for better views, mothers clucked their tongues, and somewhere in the hush of onlookers, a young girl watched wide-eyed, learning how silence might one day save her from such a seat. Then, with a heave and a splash, the stool tipped. Marjorie plunged down into the icy grasp of the pond. For a moment, the water closed above her head, muffling the gasps and murmurs from the bank. Then up she came, choking and sputtering, her hair plastered to her face like river weed. The reeve gave a solemn nod. Down she went again. Again and again, she swung above the water, plunged, emerged, gasping and shivering, while the pond swallowed her defiance one breath at a time. There was no bruising whip nor biting blade, only the relentless cold and the sting of the villagers' eyes, each pair a silent judge. By the time the stool swung back to land for the last time, Marjorie's lips were blue and her voice a whisper lost in the reeds. They untied her, half carried her to her own door, and left her there, soaked and shivering, a warning draped in dripping skirts. Long after Marjorie's ordeal, the cucking stool remained ready for the next scold. It did not care for age nor station. Wives, widows, and even a stubborn old alewife found themselves lashed to its splintered seat if their tongues wagged too wildly. The pond, too, remembered each soul dipped into its cold hush. It grew thick with reeds where children dared not play, whispering that ghosts of drowned words clung to the roots below. In time, the cucking stool became more than punishment. It was a threat that mothers whispered into the ears of quarrelsome daughters, a dread that kept gossip soft and secrets closer to the breast. Some said the pond itself seemed colder after each dipping, as though it carried away not only breath, but the warmth of a village's mercy. Yet not all who watched learned to hold their tongues. Some learned instead how to wield words in darker ways, softer, subtler. Poison dripped sweetly behind closed doors. Truths turned on their heads where no reeve could hear. For in a village that punished speech so harshly, the clever found new ways to speak and never be caught. And so, tucked away beneath mossy branches and bending willows, the cucking stool remained, a damp sentinel on the edge of everyday life. Long after Marjorie's tail had sunk beneath the pond's silver skin, the villagers would glance at that beam and chair, weathered now by rain and rot, and remember, to speak was to risk the cold embrace of water and the sharper chill of watching eyes. When you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine the stool swaying gently in the fog, the ripples of the pond murmuring secrets of all the words it has drowned. For this was but one strange seat in a kingdom of stranger punishments, each crafted to bind the tongue, the spirit, or the very soul. And in the shadows beyond that pond, deeper tales yet wait, ready to unfold where firelight flickers and the mind wanders. Beyond the pond where the cucking stool swung in its dripping silence, a darker road wound through the medieval mind. A road where punishment did not merely silence, but sought to reshape the very spirit of the condemned. And along this road, in a region where forests pressed thick and damp against lonely stone villages, there rose a tower known only to whispers, the Tower of Reflection. To call it a tower was generous. It was a squat keep, hunched like an old monk over his prayers, half swallowed by ivy and shadow. No banners flew from its cracked battlements, no guards strutted along its crumbling walls. Its strength lay not in stone nor steel, but in the fear that drifted like mist through the hamlets nearby. For within its walls lay a punishment so strange that even hardened men trembled when their footsteps drew near. In these lands, where faith and superstition danced hand in hand, certain crimes were seen not only as insults to the crown or the law, but to the soul itself. Pride, arrogance, the unyielding defiance of a serf toward his master. These were not wounds that stocks or lashes could mend. They required penance, reflection, the turning of the mind inward until the spirit bent or broke. And so the Tower of Reflection stood ready. A man named Osric once found himself dragged through its low iron gate. He had been a minor reeve, a keeper of village disputes, but had grown too fond of his own power. He took bribes openly, forced confessions from those who could not read the parchment he claimed as law, and scoffed at warnings from his betters. One night, drunk on mead and his own invincibility, he spat at the steward's feet, an insult that sealed his fate more surely than any ledger of misdeeds. Osric's trial was swift and silent. His sentence, whispered in the cold hush of dawn, he would be confined within the Tower of Reflection until humility bloomed where arrogance once rooted. And so he was led through the creaking wooden door, past damp stones that wept with the chill of forgotten years, and into a cell unlike any other. The chamber was narrow, barely wider than his outstretched arms, the ceiling so low that Osric could not stand straight, without grazing his scalp on the coarse beams above. Yet it was not the stone that made this cell his true prison, it was the mirrors. Dozens of tarnished panels lined the walls, each slightly warped, each reflecting his image back at him in strange, endless distortions. By torchlight, a single face multiplied to 1,000 grimacing masks, some stretched thin, others bloated and monstrous. In that flickering glow, Osric saw himself over and over, his prideful sneer, the set of his jaw, the defiance burning behind his eyes. The jailer spoke only once, voice muffled by the iron bars. Here you will see yourself until you know yourself. When you know yourself, you may leave. They gave him food through a narrow slit, stale bread, tepid broth that steamed weakly in the chill. He was not beaten nor tortured in flesh, but in spirit, the tower's reflections did the work of 10 whips. By day, he paced, staring at the countless versions of his own face. At night, when the torches guttered low, the mirrors caught the faintest moonlight, multiplying shadows into strange companions that shifted and sneered at him in silence. Days blurred into weeks. Osric shouted at the mirrors at first, fists thudding against the glass until his knuckles split. Yet no one answered him but himself. He begged for mercy, cursed the steward, cursed the villagers he had once ruled with careless cruelty. The mirrors answered with silence. The silence answered with Osric's own voice echoing back at him in cracked whispers. At times he tried to turn away, to press his face to the damp stones and forget the endless watchers behind him. But the room's narrowness left him no refuge. Even in the pitch of sleep, he felt them. His own eyes peering down, accusing, mocking, unchanged, while he withered. On the 33rd night, a night so cold that the torch sputtered and died before dawn, Osric at last saw something shift in the reflection. Not the glass, but himself. His eyes, once bright with venom, were hollow. His shoulders drooped. He muttered to the mirror as if to a priest, confessions spilled half-formed, apologies to faces he could no longer name. He wept then, not from the cold or hunger, but from the choking realization that every crime, every petty cruelty clung to him like a cloak he could not shrug off. When the jailer next unlocked the door, he found Osric kneeling in the center of the mirrored chamber, hands folded as if in prayer. The mirrors reflected him 100-fold, broken, but perhaps ready to be mended. He stumbled from the tower, blinking like a mole dragged from its burrow. The villagers watched him pass in wary silence. Some pitied him, seeing how thin and haunted he had grown. Others only nodded, satisfied that pride's poison had been bled away in that cold cell of silvered lies. The Tower of Reflection remained long after Osric's tale was woven into gossip and caution. It took many more men and women in its time, lords who grew too greedy, sons who defied fathers, daughters who dared speak against their mother's rule. Some emerged humble, rejoined the world with bowed heads and softer words. Others never left, their minds cracked by the endless echo of themselves, their final whispers lost in the glint of tarnished glass. Now when the moon rides high and a chill wind rustles the ivy along crumbling walls, some swear they see pale faces flicker in the tower's empty windows, ghostly reflections of pride and penitence staring forever back at themselves. And though the stones crumble and the mirrors crack with age, the memory of the Tower of Reflection lingers in the quiet parts of the mind, a reminder that the strangest punishments do not always scar the flesh, but rather the hidden corners of the soul. So rest now, while the echoes fade. But hold your breath gently, for the strangest sentence yet lies ahead, waiting where the lantern's glow cannot quite reach, in a realm where justice dances with cruelty under a moonlit sky. Far beyond the ivy-choked keep, where the Tower of Reflection brooded in its damp silence, a road of rough cart tracks and tangled hedgerows led to a village where punishment wore a mask of mockery and laughter, though its humor soured quickly on the tongue. Here, nestled in the hollow of a green valley and surrounded by sheepfolds and barley fields, a strange custom endured, one whispered of in other towns with a shudder or a snicker: the donkey parade. The donkey parade was not written in any royal decree, nor carved into oak boards nailed to the church door. Instead, it lived in the breath of village elders, handed down as both threat and entertainment. When a man's foolishness or cowardice shamed not only himself but his family and neighbors, the villagers would gather at dawn with ropes, drums, and painted masks. The guilty one, if he could be called truly guilty, would be bound not to the stocks nor a whipping post, but to a donkey's narrow back. One frostbitten morning, a farmer named Edwin found himself at the heart of this jeering ritual. Edwin was no criminal by the king's reckoning, no thief nor traitor. But when his neighbors needed him most, he had turned away. Bandits had struck at lambing time, stealing sheep from every fold but his. Some swore he had hidden in the hayloft, while his friends lost half their flocks, that he had watched through a crack in the boards, and done nothing when a widow cried out for help. His silence bought him safety and profit, but it cost him the respect of every soul who trudged the muddy lanes. So, before the frost could thaw, the village reeve and his stout-armed sons dragged Edwin from his low cottage. They stripped him of his coat, leaving him shivering in a thin linen shirt, and perched him backward on a shaggy donkey borrowed from the miller's yard. Around his neck, they hung a sign painted crudely on a plank: "Here rides the fool who hid." As the pale sun clawed its way above the hedges, the drums began, the slow, mocking thump of old kettles beaten with sticks and ladles. Children trailed behind, shouting rhymes learned from their fathers. Wives jeered from doorways, hurling handfuls of stale crusts and cabbage leaves. The donkey plodded forward, indifferent to the man who clutched its coarse mane with frozen fingers. It was not the ride alone that stung Edwin, but the laughter that danced around him like starlings. Laughter that carried his shame from the weaver's cottage to the blacksmith's yard, echoing off frost-covered stone walls. Each corner of the village green brought a new torment. A neighbor stepping out to throw rotten turnips, a clutch of giggling lads who tugged at his sign so it smacked his chest. The parade wound its way not only through the neat lanes, but out to the fields, where the trampled pasture reminded all whose flocks were lost. There the donkey paused while the Reeves' son read aloud Edwin's failings, how he hid when the bandits came, how he counted silver while others wept for missing lambs. Each word a stone thrown into the pond of rumor, sending ripples that would reach even distant kin. When the procession at last dragged itself back to the village square, Edwin's head drooped low against the donkey's scruffy neck. His legs were numb from the awkward perch. His ears rang with the drumbeat of ridicule. The Reeves stepped forward then, voice ringing clear as the morning bells. Let him who would hide from his neighbors hide now from our trust. Let him who would save himself alone walk alone. They untied Edwin from the donkey's back, but the sign stayed round his neck as they drove him to his own threshold. The door slammed shut behind him, yet the echo of laughter clung to the lintel like a curse. For weeks he did not show his face at market, nor dare speak in the tavern's smoky warmth. And when he did, the whisper followed him like a hound, the fool who hid. Some men bore the donkey parade and mended their ways, proving themselves in harvest toil or winter vigils. Others fled to distant villages, where their shame might be mistaken for a stranger's shadow. Edwin remained, tending his sheep with a back hunched lower than before. He spoke less, worked more, and gave freely when the Reeve called for aid, though none forgot the morning he rode backward on the donkey while children howled with cruel delight. Years later, when Edwin's beard turned white and his bones bent like winter branches, he would sit by his hearth, watching the flames crackle. He never spoke of that ride, but when village boys asked him for stories, he would nod gravely and say only this: "When your neighbors call, you stand by them, for if you do not stand with them, you will ride alone." And so the donkey remained, a humble beast grazing at the edge of fields, yet always ready should some fresh cowardice or folly demand its burden. The drums waited in dusty corners, the sign lay hidden beneath the Reeves' bed, and the old rhyme lingered on children's lips when nights grew long and tales were needed to hush unruly hearts. In that quiet valley, the donkey parade became more than punishment. It was a promise, a jest that cut deeper than any blade. For shame, once yoked to laughter and the donkey's steady plod, clung to the mind like a burr on a woolen cloak, impossible to shake free. So drift now toward dreams of braying donkeys and frosted hedgerows. But know this, in the next turning of our lantern's glow, stranger punishments still wait, quirks of medieval minds that turned everyday beasts, simple tools, or cruel whispers into chains far stronger than iron. The road winds on, deeper yet into the hidden chambers where the human spirit is tested, not by sword nor flame, but by ridicule, reflection, and the laughter of those who stand and watch. Beyond the laughter of the donkey parade and the cold hush of the Tower of Reflection, there lay punishments shaped not by the common folk alone, but by the careful hand of church and crown alike, devised in cloisters, scriptoriums, and stone chapels where candlelight flickered over ink-stained parchments. These were the penances that wove shame and faith into a single chain, and none was stranger than the barefoot pilgrimage. In an age when belief threaded through every furrowed brow and calloused hand, sin was not merely a matter for the soul, but for the body too. When a man or woman sinned in the eyes of the church, adultery, betrayal, heresy whispered over ale, sometimes a fine or a whipping would not suffice. Instead, the penitent would be commanded to walk, not merely to the village cross or the parish boundary, but far, barefoot, cloaked in humility, from shrine to shrine along the winding roads of Christendom. So it was that Alaric, a merchant's son, grown too bold with wine, and the wife of a fellow guildsman, found himself standing before the wooden doors of the village church as dawn spread her thin fingers of light across the graveyard. He wore no shoes, only a coarse linen tunic that did little to warm him against the morning's chill. Around his neck hung not a fine gold chain, but a placard of rough pine, carved with the words, "Adulterer, seeking forgiveness." His punishment was simple in its cruelty. He would walk to the holy shrine 3 days' journey north, where a relic of a saint lay in a gilded box beneath a flickering lamp. There he would kneel, confess anew, and beg for absolution. Until he reached that place, no roof but the open sky, no company but his own breath and the judgment of passing eyes. The priest who pronounced the sentence placed a single crust of bread in Alaric's trembling hands and a small flask of watered ale. He did not bless him with comforting words, only traced a sign in the air and turned back into the dark hush of the church. So Alaric began his walk. The first mile was not so cruel. The frost bit at his heels, but the path was soft with last autumn's leaves. He moved quickly, head bowed, hoping each hedgerow might shield him from the stares of farmers trudging out to break the frozen earth. But soon the village fell behind him, and the road grew stony, littered with shards that cut his soles until each step wept a thin line of blood. By the second day, word of the barefoot sinner traveled faster than his weary feet. Children on the road pointed and ran to their mothers. "There goes the adulterer." Shepherds paused on grassy knolls to watch him pass, leaning on their crooks, silent and pitiless. Some offered him scraps of cheese or dried apples, but none gave him boots, for that mercy would defy the penance. At night, he lay beneath hedges and low branches, curled tight to hold what little warmth the earth might share. He dreamt of the woman's smile, so warm once beneath a moonlit thatch, now a poison that gnawed at his belly like hunger. In his waking hours, he wondered if she watched from behind her shutters, knowing that each stone pressed into his flesh for a sin they both had tasted. On the third day, his feet were raw as butchered meat, wrapped in torn strips from the hem of his tunic. The road climbed steadily into hills, past roadside crosses draped in weathered garlands and candles left by other penitents whose guilt had sent them stumbling toward the same shrine. Alaric's breath rasped in the cold air. He muttered prayers half-remembered from boyhood, promises to saints whose names blurred as the pain in his legs throbbed like a drum. When at last he crested the final ridge, the shrine appeared, a humble stone chapel clinging to the slope like a barnacle to a ship's keel. Smoke drifted from its chimney, and the sound of a bell echoed down the path. Pilgrims moved slowly about the yard, some kneeling before a weathered statue, others pressing coins into a carved box. Alaric fell to his knees before the door, forehead pressed to the cold flagstones. He could not lift himself for a long while, only whispered apologies to the Virgin, to the saint whose relic he had come to honor, to a God whose forgiveness he could only hope to touch with blistered hands. Within, the priest who tended the shrine found him at dawn, huddled beside the threshold. He brought water and bread, and at last offered a single word of comfort, a blessing spoken gently into hair matted with dust and tears. Alaric's feet would heal, though the scars would dance like pale vines across his soles all his remaining days. And when he turned for home, he walked not barefoot, but in sandals given by the shrine's keeper, a token that his penance was complete, but his lesson would travel with him forever. Those who saw him return weeks later, thin as a winter branch and limping through the village gate, did not mock him outright. Some looked away, embarrassed by the depth of his shame. Others nodded once, as if to say, "Better a man walk barefoot and return humbled than stand proud and damned." So the barefoot pilgrimage lived on in whispers and sermons. It lingered in the soft rustle of feet over old roads and the hush of prayers spoken beneath shrine lamps that flickered in lonely chapels. It reminded each soul that sometimes the strangest punishment needs no iron nor whip, only the rough edge of a stony path and the weight of one's own sin pressing blistered feet onward, mile by mile, toward some distant, forgiving light. And still our candle burns, for beyond these roads and shrines, darker corners of punishment remain, chambers where human cunning twisted penance into spectacle and pain. When next our tale unfolds, follow if you dare, for stranger penances yet await those whose misdeeds call down judgment under a fickle, watchful sky. In the hush that settles beyond the winding pilgrim roads and the rough stones that tore Alaric's feet raw, There lingers a shadowy hall where punishment was neither public mockery nor holy penance, but a chilling union of spectacle and subtle cruelty. Here, in a damp corner of the medieval mind, we find the tale of the drunkard's cloak, a strange garment meant to humiliate those who lost themselves too often at the bottom of a tankard. Our story drifts now to a bustling town cradled by merchant routes and alehouses, where barrels rolled from dawn to dusk, and tavern doors never stayed shut for long. Ale and mead gave warmth against the chill, made a man's tongue loosen and his troubles drift for a time. But for some, the cup became more master than comfort. And so the town reeves devised a peculiar contrivance, equal parts punishment and jest, a barrel transformed into a prison worn upon the guilty man's back. The drunkard's cloak was simple in shape, yet cruel in burden. A large barrel, its staves iron-banded and worn smooth by countless seasons of salted fish or sour cider, was hollowed so that a hole gaped wide enough for a man's head to poke through. Smaller notches were carved for the arms. Once fitted inside, the drunkard could not lower his arms nor sit easily, for the barrel's rim bit into ribs and shoulders alike. It was a walking prison, a moving stage where his shame would be paraded for all to see. So it was that a man named Godfrey found himself squeezed within the drunkard's cloak one bitter spring morning. Godfrey had been a cooper's apprentice once. How fitting, some said, that he should end inside the very shape he used to craft. Night after night, his roaring laughter and careless fists had turned the tavern's warmth into misery for honest folk who only wished for a cup and a tale before bed. When the reeve tired of his brawls and broken promises, the barrel was dragged from a storehouse, scrubbed clean, and laid ready in the square. Godfrey was roused from his stupor with icy water and rough hands. They stripped him of his fine doublet, now stained with spilled ale, and forced him into the barrel's hollow heart. The rim scraped at his skin as his shoulders wedged through the carved openings. His head jutted from the top, hair plastered to his brow, eyes blinking in the pale light as laughter gathered like crows overhead. Behind him, boys banged spoons on kettles, and old women wagged their fingers in glee. The reeve stepped forward, reading aloud the charge that echoed off timbered houses. For drunkenness and disorder, for fists thrown and coins unpaid, let him wear his vice for all to see. They pushed Godfrey along the muddy lanes, the barrel swaying awkwardly with each step. With every stumble, the stave struck his ribs, a dull drumbeat to match the laughter that followed. At first, Godfrey snarled at the onlookers, spat curses through cracked lips, but the weight of the oak, the sneers of children who threw pebbles at the rolling sides, soon wore him thin. His shoulders throbbed. His arms, pinned out like wings, grew numb with the strain. Through the marketplace they drove him, where traders hawked cloth and salted meat. A butcher's boy slapped the barrel with a bloody handprint, leaving a smear that stuck till rain washed it away. Godfrey's eyes darted to the alehouse where his nights had once vanished in song and slurred boasts. Now its doors stayed closed, the sound of cups and chatter sealed away from the man in the moving cask. When the sun dipped toward dusk, they made him stand near the village cross, the barrel still hugging his frame. There he was left while folk drifted home, each passing him with a shake of the head or a muttered jest. At nightfall, the reeve came with a key for the iron band, cracking it loose so the stave split wide enough to free Godfrey's battered shoulders. They did not drag him to the stocks, nor strike him with lash or rod. They needed no more than the ache in his arms and the echo of laughter to do their work. He staggered home barefoot, the barrel abandoned in the square, a hollow reminder of the cost of too much ale and too little care for the peace of his neighbors. And though the tavern door opened to him again weeks later, Godfrey found that the warmth of the cup turned sour on his tongue. For every time he raised his mug, the ghost of the drunkard's cloak seemed to settle at his shoulders, the memory of oak and iron pressing him down like an unseen yoke. The cloak did not vanish with Godfrey's shame. Other barrels waited, stacked in sheds behind alehouses and reeves' halls. When tempers flared and flagons spilled, the people knew the barrel's dark embrace might come calling again. Some say the coopers, whose craft once sealed in fine wine or sweet cider, chuckled grimly at the thought that their hoops and staves could bind a man's spirit as tightly as any iron chain. So the streets stayed a touch quieter, the tankards clinked more softly, and the laughter that once roared too loud learned to hush when the Reeves men glanced toward the barrels stacked in shadow. And so our lantern glows on, for even stranger punishments slumber in old town ledgers and the dust of abandoned stocks. Next, we shall drift deeper still, into dungeons where silence becomes its own cell, or where shame wears a crown of thorns spun by human cunning and whispered threats. Rest easy for now, and let the memory of that heavy oak fade, for the night holds more secrets than even the drunkard's cloak could contain. Beyond the echo of oak staves and the mocking drum of laughter, punishment sometimes slipped past the reach of village squares and reeve stocks to find sanctuary within the hallowed walls of monasteries, where the mind, not the body, bore the brunt of judgment. There, in dim cloisters and cold stone cells, the strangest punishments of all were born from a single relentless idea: silence. In a monastery perched on a lonely rise above the River Wythe, the monks of St. Theodric's order kept the ancient rule of silence with iron devotion. Their days were measured by the toll of bells and the rustle of coarse robes along candlelit corridors. But even here, within these hushed walls, sin found its way. When it did, the punishment was not a whip across the back, nor exile to some distant priory, but a sentence to the cell of absolute silence. Among the brethren lived Brother Simon, once a novice with a quick smile and a quicker tongue. Though his prayers were devout and his hands skillful at tending the abbey's orchard, he could not tame his fondness for secret talk in the garden, soft laughter at the refectory's end, or sly questions whispered to passing pilgrims. Though gentle, his chatter stirred doubt and distraction among those who clung to silence as tightly as a knight clings to his blade. At first, the abbot's warnings were soft as falling leaves. A day's penance, then a week of solitary prayer in the side chapel. But Simon's tongue danced still, a spark in dry straw. It was not wickedness, only restlessness. But in St. Theodric's, restlessness could crack the mortar of discipline like frost creeping through stone. So on a dawn shrouded in low mist and the hush of vespers echoing in empty corridors, Brother Simon was led by two stern-faced elders to the cell of absolute silence. The door was narrow, carved of heavy oak that creaked like an old man's bones. Inside waited a bare bench of cold wood, a single narrow window no wider than a man's hand, and walls thick enough to swallow every sound. They did not bind him in chains, nor lock shackles at his wrists. Instead, they spoke the sentence once: "Here you shall find the voice you were given, and learn when it must be stilled." Then the door shut with a sigh that seemed to seal away more than a man's freedom. It sealed away his very voice. Days blurred into nights beneath that thin spill of light that crept through the slit of a window. Bread and water came once at dawn, pushed through a hatch that closed with a dull thud. The silence there was not the hush of sleep or the soft pause between prayers. It was a weight that pressed on the skull, settled into the bones. Even Simon's breath seemed loud, echoing back at him in the stone. At first, he hummed old hymns to keep himself company, but each note struck the stone and fell dead, absorbed like ink in water. He whispered psalms, then nonsense words, anything to feel sound slip from his tongue. Yet the walls offered no reply. No wind slipped through the cracks, no mice scurried underfoot. Only the heartbeat in his ears reminded him he was not entombed alive. On the seventh day, Simon stopped trying to speak. He found himself mouthing words instead, the way a dreamer mouths forgotten prayers in sleep. His mind turned inward, thoughts looping and tangling like roots beneath a winter field. He remembered his mother's voice, the orchard's soft buzz of bees, the quiet gasp of pilgrims when he asked questions forbidden by the rule. The silence turned these memories into echoes that rang louder than any word. He began to count the scratches in the mortar, the grain in the bench's splintering edge, the steps it would take to cross the cell's cold floor twice from corner to corner. His tongue ached to shape questions, jokes, anything, but there was no ear to catch them, no eye to widen in shared mischief. By the 14th dawn, when the hatch scraped open and the elders appeared, Brother Simon did not leap to his feet. He rose slowly, head bowed, lips pressed tight as if they feared to let sound slip free. The elders said nothing. There was no need. The hush clung to him like a second robe, as they led him back through the cloister where other monks watched from beneath lowered cowls. Brother Simon spoke no idle word again. Some said the silence in that cell had hollowed out the part of him that once needed to break the hush with laughter or bright curiosity. Others whispered that the silence did not kill his voice but sharpened it, turning it inward to prayer and study so deep that not even temptation could draw it back out. Years later, novices who tested the bounds of the rule would hear his quiet footfall in the orchard paths at dusk. They would glimpse his gentle nod, the calm in his eyes that needed no word to command respect. For within the hush of the cell of absolute silence, Simon had learned what the whip or stocks could never teach, that the strangest punishments are not carved in iron, but in the hidden chambers of a man's mind. And so the monastery kept its cell, stone and oak, waiting patient as time itself. It did not need bars or locks, only the silence that turned its narrow walls into a cathedral of the unsaid. And when the wind sighed through the cloisters, some claimed it carried the faintest echo of prayers mouthed but never spoken, words learned at last to rest quiet and still beneath the weight of centuries. So rest now, while the hush of Simon's penance drifts through your thoughts. For in the hush yet to come, stranger punishments lie hidden still, woven in the fabric of old villages and stone castles, where cruelty often dressed itself not in iron or flame, but in cunning and quiet, waiting to be found in the pages of a dream. Beyond the cloister's hush and Brother Simon's silent vigil, there lingered punishments shaped not in stone cells or echoing abbeys, but beneath the open sky, where cruelty took root in the everyday life of fields and pastures, disguised as chores so common no soul could guess the sting carried until the burden bent the back and tested the mind. So unfolds the tale of the wearer of the heavy sheaf. In a hamlet ringed by barley fields and chalky lanes, where windmill sails turned slow above low thatched roofs, lived folk bound more to the earth than to any distant crown. Here, a man's worth was measured not by coin alone, but by toil, by the honest sweat that darkened his collar and the calluses that toughened his palms. To cheat the plow or shirk the harvest was an insult not only to neighbor, but to God. For each ear of barley lost was a morsel stolen from every mouth come winter. So when a farmhand named Tobin was caught taking the easy path, sleeping drunk among the hay bales while others bent their backs beneath the sun, his neighbors gathered beneath the old ash tree to decide a punishment befitting his idle sin. They were no lords nor learned clerics, but they knew the land well, and they knew shame better than any law. The sentence was spoken by old Merrick, a farmer whose spine curved with years spent stooped above furrows. His voice rasped like dry straw. If Tobin will not carry his share in honest labor, he shall carry it in shame. At dawn, they roused Tobin from his tumbled blanket of hay, dragged him blinking into the yard where the harvest wagons waited. There, they bound together the largest sheaf they could muster, barley stalks tight as rope, bound with twine until it was thicker than a man's chest. They hoisted it onto Tobin's shoulders, its scratchy stems brushing his cheeks, the weight settling like a slow, cruel hand between his shoulder blades. Then they gave him his path. From the far field where the reapers worked, down the village lane to the mill, then back again, on and on until dusk's chill whispered through the hedgerows. He could not drop the sheaf, nor pause to rest it on a wagon's bed. If it slipped, they lifted it again, tighter, heavier with each bundle of fresh stalks added to its bulk. At first, Tobin trudged under the burden with muttered curses and the reek of last night's ale still drifting from his breath. But as the sun climbed, the barley stems scratched his neck raw, their dusty scent mixing with his sweat. Each step kicked up husks and dry chaff that clung to his skin like nettles. Children followed at a distance, giggling behind hands when he stumbled through the lane, his shadow long and bent. Mothers clucked their tongues from cottage doors. Some who pitied him offered a dipper of water, which he took gratefully, though each sip turned bitter when he remembered the eyes that watched him sip it. By midday, his knees buckled more than once on the rutted road to the mill. But old Merrick's sons walked behind him, prodding him upright with staves if he lingered too long on hands and knees. Each stumble brought laughter that stung worse than the sun. Each backward glance at the wagons rolling free of burdens twisted a knife deeper in his pride. In the far field, the reapers paused to watch him pass, men and women who bore their own loads by honest choice, scythes swinging in rhythm as they sliced through ripening heads of barley. They did not mock him. Their silence was heavier than jeers, a hush that spoke of broken trust more sharply than any word. When dusk spilled its pink hush over the hedgerows, Tobin reached the ash tree once more. There they lifted the sheaf from his shoulders with the same care they would lift a sack of grain. He sank to his knees in the dirt, his breath ragged, arms trembling with the ghost of the burden still pressing them down. Old Merrick looked at him then, not with cruelty, but with the weary knowing of a man who had seen too many young fools take more than they gave. A sheaf's weight is lighter than a neighbor's scorn, boy. Remember that when harvest comes again. Tobin did remember. In seasons that followed, his back bent alongside the others beneath the sun's steady glare. He rose with the crowing cockerel and shouldered sacks of grain without complaint. When strangers asked about the scarred patch on his neck, where barley stalks once rubbed him raw, he said nothing, only tugged his collar higher and pushed his pitchfork deeper into the waiting straw. So the wearer of the heavy sheaf faded into village rumor, a caution for young lads who thought themselves cleverer than the furrows they were born to turn. No stocks, nor gallows, nor royal decree was needed, just the steady weight of the harvest, the watchful eyes of neighbors, and the old ash tree where shame took root like ivy winding up ancient bark. When next the wind rattles dry barley in your dreams, remember Tobin's trudging steps and the burden bound tight across his shoulders. For in the quiet corners of medieval life, the strangest punishments were not always iron or flame. They were the simple yoke of labor, twisted into a lesson that lingered long after the sheaf was laid down and the fields turned bare under the winter's frost. And further yet, the shadows stretch, where cruelty grows cleverer still, and old minds find new ways to bend a soul beneath the weight of shame and whispered judgment. Beyond the fields where barley whispered of burdens and shame, there existed punishments that played not upon a man's shoulders or feet, but upon his deepest fear, the fear of being made the jest of every tongue. And nowhere did such fear grow sharper than in the small manors and market squares where the fool's hood awaited its next unwilling wearer. This peculiar sentence belonged not to kings or great courts, but to manor lords and guild councils, men who knew that ridicule could prick deeper than any thorn. When a villager's folly was too small for the stocks yet too sour to ignore, when debts went unpaid, oaths were broken, or petty tricks soured honest trade, the fool's hood was fetched from its nail on the lord's hall wall, its bells and scraps of motley cloth fluttering like a mockery of festivity. So it was that a tanner named Wylan found himself beneath its patchwork shadow one spring morning, when blossom dusted the orchard, and yet the air in the manor court was cold as iron. Wylan's crime was not theft, but cheating, watering down tanning solutions to stretch his coin, then selling stiff hides as supple as calfskin. When his deceit was laid bare, too many cracked boots, too many torn jerkins, he stood small before the gathered folk, the manor's steward unrolling the charge in a voice that rang off the timber beams. The fool's hood was brought forth, a ragged cap stitched from scraps of old garb dyed bright red and yellow, patched so many times it seemed more needlework than cloth. At its peak danced a limp cock's comb, and at the brow dangled 3 small bells that chimed with every tremble of the neck. Once tied beneath the chin with coarse string, it transformed any man into a walking jest, a living signboard of his own folly. They set Wylan upon a low stool in the manor courtyard, the hood perched upon his head while villagers filed past in pairs. Wives, drovers, boys with straw in their hair, each allowed a glance, a jeer, perhaps a toss of a cabbage leaf if they fancied. The steward announced that Wylan would wear the fool's hood for 3 market days, standing by the tannery gate where once he hawked his false-finished hides. On the first day, the bells rang only when Wylan shifted beneath the weight of watching eyes. He dared not lift his gaze from the muddy lane where merchants passed, shaking their heads. By midday, boys crept close, daring each other to tug at the limp cock's comb or tap a bell just to hear its pitiful chime. By the second day, The shame fermented like spoiled wine. Friends who once shared a cup crossed the street instead. A butcher who owed him coin before now paid it back with a flourish of insult, pressing each penny into Willen's palm as though dropping scraps to a begging dog. On the final morning, rain drifted soft and steady through the orchard and across the courtyard stones. The wet made the fool's hood slump over his brow, bells dull and heavy. His shoulders curled inward, hands clenched in his lap. For all their laughter, the villagers left him mostly alone that last day, perhaps out of pity, or because by then the jest had done its work. The truth of a man's deceit, paraded thrice beneath heaven's weeping sky, lingered longer than any bruised cheek or empty purse. When dusk fell and the steward came to untie the knotted string, Willen rose from his stool stiffly, the smell of damp wool and shame clinging to him as surely as his own name. He did not return to the tannery the next day. Instead, he worked for another man, scraping hides for half the wage, never again trusted to mix the vats nor touch the coin box. Some said they saw him slip coins to beggars at the market gate, as if to wash away the sound of bells that still echoed in his dreams. The fool's hood was hung once more in the manor's hall, its motley colors faded, but its lesson sharp as ever. For in the quiet countryside, where law was less the gavel's crack than a nod from the manor steward or a whisper over ale, the strangest punishments thrived on spectacle and the simple fear of a neighbor's laughter. When nights stretch long and the wind rattles the shutters, some swear they can hear the faint chime of those old brass bells, reminding folk that a man's pride can be stripped away not by rope or rack, but by the tickle of cloth and the gleam of ridicule in a neighbor's eye. So rest your thoughts now among the flickering embers of this tale, but know that deeper still lie punishments stranger yet, woven in the twisting alleys of medieval towns where the edge of shame and spectacle carved lessons no stocks nor scourge could match. And when next our lantern lifts, it shall light the path to one more chamber of cunning cruelty, waiting just beyond the hush of sleep. When the bells of St. Dunstan's tolled just past midnight, their mellow chime drifted over the thatched rooftops like a lullaby no soul wished to wake from. But beneath that hush of ancient stones and worn cobbles, the secret chambers of the old fortress whispered with memories few dared to speak aloud, stories of punishments so strange they seemed to defy reason itself. And on this night, within a drafty hall beneath flickering rushlights, our tale drifts now to a village on the edge of the marshlands, where the fog settled heavy upon the ground like a slumbering beast. Here, in this quiet hamlet called Hollowmere, there once lived a bailiff named Alderic. He was neither cruel nor kind, but possessed a mind that delighted in contrivances and cleverness. And so it was that when the villagers turned restless, mumbling of small thefts and secret trysts, Alderic declared that the old ways of fines and stocks were too mild to bind wayward spirits. Instead, he unearthed from a battered tome an idea from distant courts: the punishment of mirrored shame. The villagers gathered on the marsh edge, lanterns bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps as they ringed the village green. Alderic stood before them in a heavy wool cloak, the hood shadowing a face both thoughtful and pinched. At his feet lay a strange contraption, two polished sheets of metal, hinged like a book. Some squinted, some crossed themselves, as he spoke softly but firmly of the crime that would be addressed this night: the chronic gossip of a widow named Maudlin. Maudlin, wrapped in a thin shawl, shivered under the lantern light. Her tongue had been sharp as bramble for years, cutting neighbors' secrets to ribbons, stitching them back in new forms, and setting them loose again like foxes in the henhouse. She had been warned, then fined, but always the stories came back, crueler than before. Now, Alderic bade two constables to hold the mirrored panels before her face. In the flicker of firelight, Maudlin peered at her own reflection, a face lined like dry parchment, eyes darting like trapped mice. And there, beside her face, another mirror faced outward, catching the eyes of the gathered crowd. As she stood between the cold metal sheets, every angle revealed her shifting gaze, the tremor of her lips, the sweat that gathered beneath her bonnet. Alderic declared that for 3 nights, Maudlin would stand so at dusk until the bells of St. Dunstan's struck 9. No chains bound her wrists, no cudgels struck her back. Instead, her punishment was her own image, multiplied, cast back at her by the people whose trust she had broken. Children whispered. Old men sucked their teeth. And Maudlin, who had once felt so clever and unseen behind doors and hedges, now found nowhere to hide from the hush of her own reflection. On the second night, the fog rolled thicker than wool, yet the villagers came all the same, drawn by the strangeness of it. Some pitied her, wringing hands, wondering if this spectacle was worse than the pillory or the lash. Others found in it a morbid thrill, delighting in how the gossip's tongue curled into silence, as her own eyes accused her. By the third night, Maudlin's knees gave way, and she sat upon the cold ground, the mirrors still flanking her like unblinking sentinels. She would look at her reflection, then at the faces beyond, faces that once leaned close for her whispered tales. Now those same faces flinched from her gaze, as though fearing that to meet her eyes was to share her shame. When the final bell tolled, Alderic closed the mirrors with a metallic clap, the sound echoing through the night like a judge's gavel. Maudlin rose, slowly, stiffly, and was led away to her cottage, her tongue now as hushed as the graveyard beyond the village gate. Yet Hollowmere remembered. The mirrored shame lingered long after the lanterns dimmed. No tale passed from lip to lip without a backward glance, as though a reflection might catch a careless tongue unawares. Alderic, too, found that his invention bred unease, for if mirrors could reveal gossip, might they not one day turn upon him? Thus, the contraption was locked away in the old granary, beneath sacks of barley and rye, a relic no villager wished to test again. But word of this punishment drifted beyond the marsh, carried by merchants and pilgrims to far-flung towns. Some scoffed, calling it tame. Others shuddered, imagining the weight of one's own secrets made visible for all to see. In distant courts, curious minds scribbled notes, pondering what else might be reflected back at the guilty. And in Hollowmere, mothers still told their children to mind their words, for the marsh mists could conjure mirrors when least expected. So, the punishment of mirrored shame faded into whispered memory. One more oddity in a world that spun on rumor and fear, superstition and spectacle. And though the fortress walls of St. Dunstan's kept their silence, deep beneath the stones, the stories murmured on. Tales of tongues bound by iron, secrets bared by reflection, and the unsettling truth that the cruelest prison might not be chains or gallows, but the unblinking eye of one's own conscience. Beyond Hollowmere, the road wound through damp meadows and past quiet abbeys where monks copied texts by guttering candlelight. Somewhere, a scribe scratched down Alderic's strange idea in the margins of a legal scroll, marking the page for a lord who fancied himself a keeper of order. Thus did the mirrored shame flicker on, a curious footnote in the vast ledger of punishments that humankind devised to tame its restless heart. And while the villagers drifted back to their thatched homes, shutters drawn tight against the night wind, the marsh mist crept in, patient, unjudging, smoothing the footprints on the green. Above, the moon laid its silver gaze upon Hollowmere, a silent mirror of its own, reflecting a world ever hungry for tales of transgression, penance, and the strange alchemy that turned fear into fable. So let the bells of St. Dunstan's toll on, and the fortress stones hold fast their secrets. For in the hush between heartbeats, the mirrored punishment lives on, waiting for the next tale, the next whisper, the next curious soul to wonder just how far a mind might go when it seeks to bind what slips so easily from the lips of humankind. When dawn broke over Hollowmere and the last whispers of the mirrored shame settled into legend, the restless murmur of strange punishments drifted once more toward the heart of the old realm, where the hills rose gentle and green, and the rivers curled like silver ribbons through valleys dotted with timbered cottages. There, in the county of Eldergrove, an altogether different form of retribution took root, one that preyed not upon reflection, but upon the bitter company of nature's smallest tormentors. It began in the courtyard of Eldergrove's modest manor, where the lord, Sir Edwin of the Thorned Hall, ruled with a mind both cunning and oddly poetic. Sir Edwin fancied himself a patron of peculiar justice, forever seeking ways to make the punishment match the crime in some crooked rhyme of cause and effect. When the orchard keepers came to him, complaining of a spate of petty thefts, ripe apples spirited away under moonlight, pears plucked before their time, he resolved that mere stocks or fines were far too plain to quell such mischief. On a morning thick with the scent of rain and bruised fruit, a boy named Corbin was dragged before Sir Edwin. Barely 15 summers old, Corbin had been caught red-handed, pockets stuffed with windfalls meant for the manor's kitchens. His cheeks, still soft with youth, flushed crimson beneath the gaze of villagers assembled by the orchard fence. They expected a whipping, or a branding at worst. But Sir Edwin, perched on a carved oak chair, tapped his fingers against the armrest and mused aloud of wasps. "For if this boy is so fond of sweet things," he said, voice smooth as pond water, "then let sweetness cling to him a while, that he may taste it not as a thief, but as a feast for those whose sting he invites." The villagers looked at one another, puzzled murmurs threading through the orchard's leafy hush. Corbin's eyes darted about, seeking an ally, a soft heart, but none stepped forward. Sir Edwin motioned to his reeve, a stooped man with gnarled hands and a mouth that never smiled. Together, they brought forth a small cask of honey, its scent drifting warm and wild on the breeze. Before all gathered, Corbin was stripped to his linen undershirt and bound gently but firmly to a stout apple tree. His arms were spread just wide enough that he could not slip free, though no rope cut harshly into his skin. The reeve dipped a brush into the golden sweetness, then daubed it upon the boy's wrists, neck, and chest, painting him as though he were a harvest sacrifice to the orchard itself. At first, the boy wept and trembled, tears carving tracks through the sticky sheen. Sir Edwin spoke softly of choices and consequences, of the orchard's gift and the orchard's guardians. Then he stepped back, his boots sinking into the loamy ground, and ordered all to leave the grove in hush and order. Corbin was left alone, the branches above heavy with the very fruit he had tried to steal. It did not take long. First came the flies, bold and curious, tasting the sweetness with delicate feet and darting away only to return in greater numbers. Then the wasps, drawn by some hidden music in the air, circled in lazy spirals before settling upon his honeyed skin. Corbin whimpered and flinched, but bound as he was, he could do little but stand beneath the shifting shadows of the orchard canopy. Time stretched thin in that grove. Birds fell silent. Now and again, a ripe apple dropped with a soft thud to the mossy earth, startling the boy into fresh sobs. He could feel the tiny feet, the probing stings, the gentle torment of nature exacting a price for stolen sweetness. And yet, Sir Edwin had ordered the boy left just long enough that no lasting harm would come, save perhaps to the pride that had led him to believe he could pluck from the trees unseen. At dusk, when the sun dipped behind Eldergrove's rolling hills, the reeve returned with 2 stout orchard hands. They found Corbin pale and trembling, the honey gone to stickiness, the wasps drifting off sated to their hidden nests. They cut him free, carried him to a trough where cool water washed away the last clinging traces of sweetness and sting alike. Wordless, they wrapped him in a rough blanket and left him on the stoop of his mother's cottage, where the door creaked open like the sigh of an old tree. And so the tale of Corbin's honey shame wove itself into Eldergrove's nights. For seasons afterward, no hand strayed toward the orchard's branches, unless the reeve himself had weighed and counted each apple fair. Children whispered of the boy who became a hive's banquet, and farmers from neighboring villages came to peer at the very tree where it had happened, tracing finger to bark as if the story itself might seep into their skin. Sir Edwin, content with his odd brand of balance, wrote to distant cousins of his nectared penance, boasting of its elegance and mercy. Some praised him, calling him wise. Others shuddered, wondering what new contrivance might bloom from such a mind should greater crimes cross his path. In quiet moments, when the orchard wind rustled low and sweet through boughs heavy with fruit, the villagers half believed they could hear the hum of unseen wings, like a reminder that nature's smallest creatures could be conscripted as jailers when man's own laws fell short. Beyond Eldergrove, too, the story spread, woven into fireside talk, spun into cautionary verse, carried by travelers who spoke of a lord who made a boy wear the orchard's honey like a crown of shame. Some laughed, some frowned, but all leaned closer, drawn to the strangeness of it, the mingling of sweetness and sting, crime and penance, memory and myth. So the land dreamed on, orchard boughs swaying, rivers singing their soft silver tune, and in that hush between fruit and blossom, another whisper of medieval punishment nestled among the roots, waiting for the next hungry hand to reach, the next foolish heart to test the orchard's patience, and the curious justice of the Lord, who believed that sweetness, stolen, must one day be repaid in kind. When winter's hush came at last to Elder Grove, burying the orchard in frost and drawing the final wasps into sleep within hollow logs, Sir Edwin's tale of honeyed shame drifted off on the tongues of passing pilgrims. And so it found its way to the ears of another lord, one who ruled not orchards but crossroads, forests, and the thin, treacherous paths where travelers might vanish without so much as a footprint left in the drifting snow. His name was Lord Halric of Bramblehold, a keep that rose from a rocky bluff like a clenched fist against the sky. Halric was neither young nor old, his hair streaked silver, his gaze sharp as a falcon's, but he bore a reputation for savoring fear, as a hunter savors the scent of fresh game. In Bramblehold, crime was not uncommon. The land's twisting roads bred wayfarers as much as they bred cut-purses and beggars. And so, when talk of petty bandits reached Lord Halric's cold hall, he sought a punishment that would do more than bind wrists or break backs. In the valley below Bramblehold wound the ancient heartwood, a forest older than the keep's first stone, a tangle of oaks, yews, and blackthorn, whose paths turned travelers about like dancers in a reel. It was said that to enter Heartwood was to gamble with one's very sense. Many had emerged days later, raving of spirits and voices in the fog, their eyes wide as the moon. When Halric's guards caught two brothers, Merritt and Wulfric, stealing from wagons bound for the hold, he did not order the noose or the stocks. Instead, he decreed they would meet the forest itself, and in doing so, they would learn whether the fear they sowed might return tenfold upon their own flesh. At dawn they were bound, not in chains, but in wreaths of hawthorn. Twigs studded with cruel thorns pressed into the skin of their arms, their ankles. Their tunics were stripped to rags, leaving them shivering in the bite of winter's breath. The villagers, gathered in the Bailey yard, watched in uneasy silence as Halric's reeve read aloud the charge. Theft, deceit, the waylaying of honest folk. Then each brother was handed a single lantern, an iron cage cradling a stuttering flame, fed by oil that would not burn for more than half a night. In their free hand, each carried a staff cut fresh from the thorn bush that crowned the keep's wall. With these meager tools, they were led to the Heartwood's edge and told this: walk into its heart and remain until the lantern's flame dies. Should they emerge too soon, they would face the gallows. Should they fail to return by dawn's first light, the forest would claim them for its own. Some villagers wept to see it, others turned their faces aside, for all knew that Heartwood cared little for mercy or mortal bargains. Into the mist they went, the crunch of frost beneath their boots swallowed by the hush of ancient boughs. Their lanterns bobbed like fireflies in the gloom, quickly swallowed by the folds of bramble and vine. Within the Heartwood, the brothers pressed close together at first, Merritt's breath a ragged whisper, Wulfric's grip on his staff tight enough to draw blood. The wind hissed through blackthorn hedges, carrying strange echoes, the bark of a fox, the shriek of an owl, the phantom creak of unseen boughs. Hours passed like centuries. The oil in the lanterns sputtered lower. The forest crowded around them, paths doubling back, clearing and closing again like a mouth half-formed in the fog. They stumbled over roots slick with hoarfrost, thorns tearing at their skin, until the hawthorn wreaths were lost in a patchwork of scratches and bleeding welts. As midnight deepened, the brothers quarreled. Merritt, the elder, wished to turn back, to beg the mercy of the gallows over the silent dread of the wood. Wulfric, desperate and wild-eyed, urged them deeper, certain that somewhere within lay an old hermit's trail that might deliver them safely home. Back and forth they stumbled, lantern flames guttering like dying stars. They called to one another in voices hoarse and raw, but each word seemed muffled by moss and bark. And then, when the final flicker of oil hissed into darkness, they found themselves alone. No stars pierced the canopy, no path led clear. Only the sigh of the Heartwood remained, a lullaby for lost men. Some say Merritt fled into the brush, never to be seen again. Others claim Wulfric knelt beside the stump of an ancient oak, his staff clutched to his chest as if to warm the cold within his bones. Come dawn, the reeve and his men entered Heartwood's frost-bound hush. There they found Wulfric, tangled in bramble, eyes wide and unseeing, yet his lips still parted, as if whispering secrets only the forest knew. Of merit, not a sign remained, save for the faint drag of footprints that ended in a mire so dark and deep none dared wade into its grasp. When word of this punishment spread, the name Bramblehold gathered new weight, spoken with a shudder by travelers who paused at its crossroad inns, who prayed the night would not find them under Heartwood's twisted boughs. For Lord Halrick's lesson was cruel but clear, that some crimes drew no blood at the gallows, yet bled the soul dry all the same. So did the Heartwood sleep again beneath its winter mantle, roots coiling deeper, branches creaking low as though murmuring the brothers' names. And at the keep upon the bluff, Halrick sat by his hearth, a thin smile flickering across his face as the wind clawed at the shutters, carrying the forest's secrets ever onward, to be woven into yet another whispered tale of punishments, strange enough to outlive the men who bore them. And far beyond Bramblehold's frostbound gates, the realm turned under winter's hush, hungry still for stories of thorns and lanterns, of woods that watched and men who vanished like breath upon the cold, bitter air. When the final days of winter surrendered to the hesitant promise of spring, Bramblehold's tale of the brothers lost to the Heartwood drifted like thawing mist across market squares and roadside hearths. Yet even as travelers murmured of hawthorn wreaths and lantern flames swallowed by ancient trees, another story was quietly preparing to unfurl its dark petals, a punishment so peculiar that it clung to memory like ivy to crumbling stone. It was far to the south, in a shire known simply as Thistledown, where barley fields rolled gentle as a dream and shepherds dozed beneath budding hedgerows. There, the folk were known for their patient ways and the soft music of their speech. But beneath this pastoral hush lay an old suspicion that idleness bred mischief, and mischief, unchecked, could rot the root of an entire village. So it was that when the squire's steward, a narrow man named Osric, uncovered a curious pattern of laziness among the field hands, he resolved to craft a retribution that would burrow beneath the skin, reminding all that the land's quiet gift of plenty could turn thorned when neglected. In the heart of Thistledown rose a small, time-worn chapel, its stone walls cool with moss and its bell long cracked from countless harvest prayers. Here Osric gathered the villagers on a mild morning, the scent of damp earth rising with the promise of new sowing. Before them he brought forth 4 young men, farm lads whose names had long been muttered over mugs in the alehouse. Caught shirking their rows, leaving barley to wither unharvested, they had claimed rain, claimed blight, claimed weariness of bones not yet 20 winters old. But Osric, who loved no excuse, declared their idleness an offense to soil and sun alike. And so he revealed the idle men's share, a circle of stones within the chapel yard, each marked with the sign of the old ways, runes for toil, for patience, for the turning of the seasons. Within this circle, the 4 were led, each stripped to rough tunics and set barefoot upon the cold, damp earth. Before them lay sacks of barley seed, and before each sack a small iron scoop, no more than a spoon in size. The punishment was simple. Osric intoned to the gathering hush. From sunrise to sundown, the 4 would scoop seed by the spoonful, carrying it one pace beyond the circle's edge and pressing it into the soil with bare hands. Again and again, each spoonful would plant what their idleness had cost. It seemed almost laughable at first. Some villagers smirked. Children whispered behind weathered palms. But as the sun rose higher, laughter faded, for the ground was chill and the iron spoon cold against blisters that bloomed raw upon young palms. The lads stooped and straightened, breath coming harsh as the afternoon shadows stretched longer than the neat rows they sowed. Crows gathered, curious and bold, hopping from fence post to stone. They plucked at stray seeds, forcing the lads to plant more, ever more. By dusk, their shoulders drooped, knees caked with mud, fingers split, and grain dust tangled in their hair. But Osric, a parchment tucked beneath his arm, counted each small mound, marking every pace made from the circle's edge. And so it went for 3 days, an endless cycle of spoon and soil, each lad's back bent beneath the burden of a task that mocked his careless idleness with its very simplicity. When blisters wept and muscles burned, there were no stocks to confine them, only the circle and the eyes of neighbors who knew well how each seed pressed into earth was a penance more lasting than any lash. On the 4th dawn, Osric dismissed them. No chains bound their ankles, no rope dragged them away. They were free to stumble home through barley rows newly sown by hands that now understood the weight of a single grain. The villagers watched them go, heads bowed, limbs trembling, and then turned to the neat furrows stretching from the chapel yard like pennants made manifest in living green. When spring gave way to summer, and the barley rose pale gold against the sun's easy smile, mothers brought their children to the edge of that circle. They showed them the rows, told them of the spoon and the stones, spoke of how idleness could turn a good harvest to dust if left to grow like weeds in an untended mind. Far beyond thistledown, too, the tale found ears eager for the strangeness of it, a punishment that seemed so gentle, yet proved a grinding chain to pride and youthful ease. Some scribes scribbled it in the margins of law books, monks copied it into quiet chronicles of the shire, while minstrels wove it into rhymes of barley and penance that drifted from village to village like drifting seed. And so, as the old chapel bell hung cracked and silent above the fields, the lesson took root deeper than any barley row ever could, that the land, so soft beneath bare feet, could become a stern jailer when its gifts were squandered, that a man's own hand could be turned against his folly, spoon by spoon, seed by seed, until toil itself bloomed as punishment and reward alike. Thus do the most curious punishments linger, woven into hedgerows and hearthside tales, told in soft voices when dusk leans low over the fields. And in that hush between plow and prayer, between idle dream and blistered palm, the realm slumbers on, ever hungry for stories of men and their misdeeds, and the endless, winding ways that justice finds them beneath the same patient sun.